There's a certain kind of silence that only exists after midnight. Not empty, not hollow, but listening. The world thins a little. Walls remember things. Shadows lean closer. And if you're awake right now, if you're hearing my voice in the small hours, then maybe you felt it too, that soft pressure at the edges of reality. Like the dark is gently asking you a question you don't quite want to answer. Tonight, I want you to lie back. Slow your breathing. Let the room settle around you. We're going to wander together, not into nightmares, not into gore or screams, but into the kind of stories that stay with you like the echo of a dream. Stories about the things that wait in old wells and locked rooms. The ghosts of hospitals that never learned how to sleep. The doors that don't belong. The children who don't understand that fire burns. And the loved ones who stand quietly on the other side of the yellow line, keeping watch when we almost step too far. These aren't tales of monsters. They're stories about boundaries between past and present, memory and forgetting, the living and the almost gone, and the soft, aching question beneath it all. What follows us into the dark, and what refuses to leave. So, keep the lights low, stay where it's safe, and if you hear your name whispered from somewhere you can't quite see, don't answer just yet. Welcome to tonight's collection, The Guardian of the Well. Rain follows a different rhythm in the Welsh countryside. It doesn't fall so much as drift, sweeping across the fields in slow, slanted veils that blur the edges of the world until the hills dissolve into the sky. That was the first thing Elias noticed when the single-track road narrowed to the width of his little red hatchback and the hedgerows began closing in on him like a pair of tired green lungs. The second thing he noticed was the silence, not the absence of noise, but the kind of silence that feels aware, as though the earth itself were holding its breath. He had always preferred places like this. Places with stories. Places that had slipped out of the present day and into some strange archive of memory and soil. As a photographer, he made a living capturing abandonment, skeletal Victorian greenhouses, empty seaside arcades, rural chapels left to rot under ivy and moss. Clients paid him well when they needed bleakness. His name appeared in editorial spreads under titles like Forgotten Britain or The Place's Time Misplaced. But this trip wasn't for a client. This one was a rumor. He'd first heard of March while leafing through fragile municipal records in a local library, a farming village in Powys, abandoned in the 1,950 seconds after a water source incident that had never been elaborated on in the notes. No photographs existed of the place after 1953. No census entries. No land use updates. The village simply fell off the map, which, for Elias, made it irresistible. The road bent sharply and the hedges parted like curtains. Ahead, the land dipped into a shallow valley, and there it was at last. A huddle of stone cottages, roof sagging, chimneys broken, windows hollowed out. Grass had claimed the lanes, tall and wet and whispering against the car doors as he rolled slowly forward. He cut the engine. Immediately, the silence surged in, thick and damp, wrapping itself around him like the fog that clung to the hillsides. There were no birds, no sheep calls, not even the far-off hum of a tractor, just the muted tick of his cooling engine. And beyond that, nothing. He swallowed. This is what you came for, he reminded himself. He stepped out into the soft, yielding mud and inhaled the scent of wet earth and stone, old stone, the kind that had outlived generations and would outlive him too. He slung his camera bag across his shoulder, adjusted the waterproof with fumbling fingers, and began to walk. The houses felt oddly arranged, as though someone had picked them up like chess pieces and scattered them. Some leaned drunkenly toward each other. Others faced away at strange angles. Elias paused to photograph doorways, black as throats, and shattered windows slick with rain, lingering on textures, peeling paint, flaking lichen, rusted hinges bent like arthritic fingers. A narrow lane curved deeper into the village core, where the cottages thinned out and the ground dipped again toward a small, uneven clearing. And that was where he saw it. The well. It sat at the center of the clearing like an anchor, a circle of stone older than the houses, ringed by waist-high walls blackened with age and moisture. A wooden cover once must have sealed it, but only warped fragments remained, scattered nearby like broken ribs. From the lip of the well hung 3 iron chains, rusted the color of dried blood, vanishing into the darkness below. Elias slowed to a stop. The air changed. Not colder, exactly, just denser. As though the atmosphere around the well had thickened into something syrupy, something reluctant to be disturbed. Surely it was only his imagination. And yet, the silence had taken on a shape. It pooled around the stones. It listened. He wiped rain from his eyelashes and stepped closer. The chains fascinated him. They weren't delicate household chains, nor decorative farm fixtures. These were heavy, industrial, each link as broad as 2 fingers, the rust pitted and rough. His fingertips brushed one and came away faintly orange. Who chains a well? And why 3? He leaned over the stone rim. The darkness below swallowed light greedily. Even when his eyes adjusted, the void remained stubborn and absolute, drinking in every stray glimmer. Water should have reflected something back, a glint, a shadow, a trembling echo of the sky, but there was nothing. Only depth, only absence. A faint smell rose from within. Not sewage, not rot. Something cooler, older, like rain trapped in slate for 1,000 years. He realized, with a small, inward laugh, that he was holding his breath. It's a hole in the ground, Elias. Don't be ridiculous. He backed away a pace and took several photos. The stone, the clearing, the chains draped like sleeping serpents. The camera shutter broke, the silence, in neat, surgical clicks. But the images, once reviewed on his LCD screen, felt strangely flat. The stillness of the well didn't translate. The weight of it, that strange, patient gravity, was lost. He glanced back down into the dark. A thought unspooled itself in his mind, slow and inevitable. What if I lower the camera? He had done so before, in wells and cellars and forgotten mine shafts across the country. He carried a compact rig for that exact purpose. A small, slow-motion action camera fitted with stabilizing housing, capable of extremely low light capture. He could suspend it on a strap, let it descend, retrieve it, and see what the human eye might miss. He told himself it was curiosity, professional interest, documentation, but something deeper fluttered its wings inside his chest. Not fear, recognition. He set the camera housing on the stone lip of the well and felt the surface slick and gritty beneath his hands. The rain had softened to a fine mist, settling into his beard and dampening the collar of his jacket. He threaded the strap carefully through a carabiner, testing the weight, the strength. Then he took a breath and began to lower the camera into darkness. The chains rattled faintly at the disturbance, giving a small metallic sigh, as though they hadn't been touched for years. The strap unspooled, hand over hand. A meter, 2, 3. The darkness accepted the camera with a quiet, swallowing patience. The little confidence LED glowed weakly, painting the stone throat of the well in a sickly green halo. Drops of condensation clung to the lens like tiny pearls and fell away into nothing. The further it went, the more Elias found himself leaning forward, unconsciously mirroring the camera's descent. The silence deepened to the point where he could hear his own breathing inside his head, the faint throb of blood near his temples. How deep are you? 5 meters, perhaps. Maybe more. His arm began to ache. The strap trembled faintly with each micro-movement of his hand. He imagined the camera hanging there in the cold dark, surrounded by stone older than memory, dangling above water black enough to erase anything that touched it. He counted to 10, then 20, then 25. Enough. He carefully drew the strap back up. The camera emerged, wet and blinking, from the mouth of the well like something reborn. He wiped the lens with a microfiber cloth and slid the device from its casing, fingers suddenly clumsy with eagerness. He wanted to see. He needed to see. He crossed to a fragment of wall, slipped into the lee of it to shelter the screen from the mist, and opened the playback. Static grain, distorted, watery audio picking up the faint churn of wind through reeds, stone throat drifting past. The LED light washed the well interior with soft illumination. Everything exactly as expected. The camera continued downward. He felt a peculiar, anticipatory tension looking at the footage as though some instinct had already leapt ahead of him, whispering that something was coming. The image jostled slightly as the strap swayed. Moisture drifted past the lens like tiny jellyfish in a dark aquarium. Then the frame stabilized. The light broadened. The bottom. There should have been water, a black mirror, at least. Instead, the floor was stone, and seated upon that stone, perfectly centered beneath the shaft, was a man. Elias stopped breathing. The man sat cross-legged, hands resting palm up on his knees, body slack with impossible stillness. He wore Elias's jacket, Elias's jeans, Elias's boots, still faintly scuffed with the pale mud from the lane, and his face. His face was tilted upward toward the camera, toward the sky that the lens represented, toward Elias. Only the eyes were wrong. They were not eyes at all, but white blanks, porcelain pale, gleaming faintly in the LED glow like the inside of a cracked seashell. No pupils, no iris, no depth, just emptiness where sight should have been. And yet, he knew with the cold certainty of a nightmare remembered too clearly that the thing at the bottom could see him. He watched his own mouth move. No sound came through the recording, but the lips formed a shape with dreadful clarity. Hello. Elias shut off the camera. The clearing was suddenly too large, too exposed. The rain whispered urgently through the grass. He stared at the blank screen, heart sounding a dull, icy drum inside his chest. And for the first time since arriving in Quimmarch, he realized there might have been a reason the village was left to the moss and rain. And somewhere, deep beneath his feet, the chains shifted, as though something below had begun to stand. Dying, dying, bun, dying, 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 dying. Elias didn't move for a long moment. The screen had gone black, yet the image lingered behind his eyes like the afterburn of a camera flash himself. Cross-legged, waiting in the dark with those empty white eyes that reflected nothing but the trembling LED glow. The longer he stared at the dead screen, the more he felt the weight of the earth beneath his boots, the layers of soil and stone and forgotten years separating him from that impossible reflection. It felt like standing on a frozen lake and realizing there were shadows moving just beneath the ice. He exhaled slowly through his nose, forcing his lungs to behave, and slipped the camera back into its protective case. The motion felt oddly intimate, like covering the face of a corpse. He told himself he needed context, that there would be some reasonable explanation. A trick of the lens, a reflection, a glitch in the software, something, anything. But when he wiped his fingers on his jeans, the faint tremor in them betrayed him. He looked back at the well. It hadn't changed. The stone rim glistened with moisture. The chain swayed almost imperceptibly, as though disturbed by a breath that wasn't his. The clearing remained still. The houses slumped in silent retreat at the edges like old dogs afraid to be too close. He became aware sharply, irrationally of his own posture, his own hands, his own blinking. The notion struck him with sudden clarity. I am being watched by myself. He shook his head at the absurdity of it. Get a grip, he murmured aloud, just to hear a human voice break the silence. His words sounded small, thin. They didn't go far before dissolving. Work. He needed to work. He needed to ground himself in routine framing, composition, exposure, light. He took several more photographs. The chains, the lip of the stone, the broken cottages in their crooked row, but found that every time he raised the camera, an involuntary thought rose like a bubble through dark water. He's still down there, still sitting, still looking up. Eventually, the tension became unbearable. He needed to know more. A collapsed building near the edge of the clearing caught his attention. The roof had fallen inward, leaving only ribs of timber. Inside, the shadows were deeper, the air stale and preserved from the wind. Moss had crept into the corners like a quiet, patient infection. Along the back wall, a heavy wooden cabinet lay on its side, its drawers splayed open like gasping mouths. Elias stepped over the broken frame and crouched to sift through the debris. Damp paper, mouse-gnawed receipts, scraps of newspaper that melted at his touch. But beneath it all, protected by a warped wooden cover, he found a small ledger. The pages thick and yellowed with time. The ink had bled in places, but the heading remained legible. To View March Parish Wealth Fund, 1,949. His heartbeat quickened. He carried the ledger to the threshold where the light was better and began leafing through its brittle pages. Most entries were mundane collections for repair work, small recorded donations until the writing changed. The earlier neat clerk's hand gave way to a sharper, more frantic script. No one to draw water after sundown. That is the agreement. Chains inspected 6th April secure. Children must not approach alone. He says the sitting one is still waiting. The sitting one? Elias's throat tightened. He turned another page. The entries became more sporadic. Ink blotted. Lines crowded together without margins, as though the writer's thoughts were hurrying to get out ahead of something approaching. The teacher says the well predates the chapel. Predates the field markers, too. There have always been two, the one above and the one below. If the watcher leaves his seat, the water turns. Mare Evans swears she saw her Reese walking home while Reese himself was still in the barn. The dog wouldn't go near him. That's twice this month. Councilman came again. Says they will fill it. We warned him. The next line was written heavier, the nib biting deep into the page. It cannot be filled. Something must always be beneath. Elias stared at the words until they began to blur. A breeze slipped through the broken doorway and stroked the back of his neck like a cold finger. He turned, half expecting to see someone watching from the lane outside, one of the former villagers. Or worse, a pale echo of himself. But there was only the rain and the indifferent fields beyond. He went back to the book. One final entry, dated 1,953, just months before the record ceased. We leave tomorrow. The water tastes wrong already. The chains are singing in the night, but I fear we take the danger with us if we go. For who will sit? Who will keep watch in the dark when the last of us is gone? There was no signature, just an ink blot, like a drowned eye staring up from the page. He closed the ledger with slow, careful hands and set it gently on the upturned cabinet, as though placing a fragile body back into rest. The churchyard dampness had crept into his bones. The silence had thickened to syrup again. Every passing minute deepened his awareness of the hollow beneath his feet, that stone throat, the chains, the waiting figure with blank eyes. It was time to leave. At least for now. He'd return later, perhaps. With distance and fresh perspective, the footage would feel less like a verdict and more like data. He walked back toward the car, but halfway down the lane, he stopped. Someone was standing at the far end of the row of cottages, just where the road dipped toward the lower field. A figure with shoulders hunched against the rain, head tilted slightly downward, clothes clinging dark and heavy to a familiar frame. For a heartbeat, Elias felt nothing. Then his mind stepped closer than his body dared. It was his jacket, his posture, the shape of his beard around his jaw, even the slight inward turn of his left foot, an old fracture that had never healed quite right. The figure didn't move, didn't wave, didn't turn, just stood there, faint and blurred by the rain, like a reflection glimpsed in a black glass window. Elias blinked. The lane was empty. His pulse shuddered through him, hot and nauseating. He stood there in the middle of the grass-choked road, rain pinning his clothes to his skin like a weight, willing his own breath to steady. Logic rallied desperately, offering explanations one by one. A trick of light, a villager's portrait, stress, fatigue, imagination. But logic had not lowered that camera into the well. Logic had not seen what waited below. He forced himself to walk, not run to the car. Each step deliberate and childish in its determination not to betray fear. He unlocked the door, slid inside, and shut out the wet with a hollow metallic thud that seemed absurdly loud after the village's silence. For a moment, he simply sat there, raindrops tracing frantic paths down the windscreen like panicked insects. The steering wheel felt cool beneath his palms, the fabric of the seat pressed against his back. Familiar, solid, real. He checked the rearview mirror. There was nothing behind him except the faded grass and the skeletal cottages. He turned the key. The engine coughed to life, a domestic comforting sound, like a dog barking in the dark. He reversed carefully, the tires whispering through the wet, then turned the car back toward the single-track lane that had carried him into the valley. As he drove, The hedgerows rose again on either side, tall and close, restoring the sense of tunnel vision. The road twisted through hills and past stands of trees shedding long tattered leaves into the ditch. 15 minutes passed, then 20. Rain drummed a metronome on the roof. Only when the valley was fully behind him did he realize he'd been gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had gone pale. He stopped at a lay-by overlooking the hills, a place where the Gower light would spill beautifully on a calmer day, and switched off the engine. The world outside was awash of pewter grays and cold greens. Mist drifted among the slopes like unspooling thread. He needed to watch the footage again. Not all of it, just enough to confirm. To anchor the memory in something other than the wild, trembling territory of his mind. He opened the file. The descent. The stone walls. The persistent hush of wind through the chain microphone. Then the bottom. The floor. His body. The white eyes tilted up toward the sky. Only now, as he watched the figure again, he noticed something he had missed before. The him at the bottom blinked. Not a twitch. Not an artifact. A slow, deliberate, human blink lid sliding cleanly over white nothingness before lifting again to reveal the same blank surface. And the corners of the figure's mouth twitched, as though fighting the urge to smile. Elias's own lips pressed into a harsh line. His reflection in the dark gloss of the screen stared back at him, the normal version, with brown irises and uncertain expression separated from the blank-eyed guardian by a membrane thinner than glass. He closed the player with a sharp motion and stared out across the valley. The villagers had written of two selves, one above, one below, a balance maintained by sitting, watching, waiting, a chair at the bottom of the world that must never be left empty. But Elias had come with curiosity. He had brought light. He had made the watcher aware of the surface again, and as the rain hushed across the car roof, he could not shake the sense that a chair had scraped quietly back in the dark beneath the well, and someone had begun to stand. Behind him, in the rear-view mirror, something shifted. For an instant no more, he saw a shape seated on the back seat of the car. His own shoulders, his own head, bowed slightly, as though listening to the engine idle. No eyes. Just smooth, white plain where sight should be. He spun around. The seat was empty. The upholstery held nothing but the faint indentation of his own earlier weight. The silence in the car changed pitch, no longer comforting. Thin, hollow, expectant. Elias turned the key again, and as the engine rolled them back onto the narrow lane and the hedgerows closed around him once more, he realized something that made the hairs along his forearms rise, one by one. He had left the well, but the well had not left him. And that's not. Elias didn't go straight home. He told himself he should have. That the sane, simple, adult thing would have been to drive south toward the motorway, return to his flat, shower until the water warmed his bones again, and file the entire experience under odd, unsettling, worth thinking about later. But instead, he found himself drifting, almost sleepwalking, into the small market town that lay cradled between hills a few miles from CBUM March. It was the kind of place built of slate and endurance. A single high street gathered everything into itself. A butcher with faded window decals, a pharmacy whose fluorescent lighting hummed like a trapped insect, a charity shop with a headless mannequin wearing a cardigan that had outlived several owners. At the far end of the row stood a pub, the Falcon and Crown, sign hand-painted, windows dimmed with condensation. It felt like a doorway into a slower century. Elias parked across the street and sat for a moment before going in. He watched the raindrops slip down the windscreen, gathering into trembling rivers that made the world melt and reform again. The reflection in the glass, his reflection, looked tired, paler than usual. His eyes remained brown and recognizable, but when he blinked, he half expected white emptiness to be waiting for him on the other side of the lids. He laughed at himself, quietly, without humor. Then he went inside. The warmth struck him first, a dense inward breath of heat, and the smell of old beer, caramelizing onions, and damp coats steaming near the radiator. The floor was flagstone worn to a sheen by decades of boots. The ceiling beams stooped low, dark as soaked bread, forcing even average-height patrons into a polite bow. Only a handful of people occupied the place. 2 men in high-vis jackets leaned over pints at a corner table. their conversation rising and falling like waves breaking on a pebble beach. A woman near the fire read a battered paperback, one finger marking her place even as she turned the page. The bar was tended by a tall, spare man with silver hair pulled neatly into a low tail. He looked up. "All right there?" His voice belonged to the land unhurried, weathered into a kind of patience. "Yeah. Hi." Elias managed a weak smile. "Could I get a coffee? Black. And maybe whatever you've got left of lunch." The bartender nodded. "Soup do? Leek and potato. That would be perfect." The man disappeared into a back kitchen and the pub swallowed Elias quietly into itself. He chose a corner table near the window, set his bag down within reach. The camera inside felt heavier than usual and let his shoulders sag at last. Coffee arrived in a thick-lipped mug that had once been white and was now the color of old parchment. The first sip grounded him. Normal heat, normal taste, normal life. "Been walking?" the bartender asked lightly, noticing the mud spattered along the hem of Elias's jeans. "Photographing," Elias replied. "Ruins, old settlements." The word settlements hung there like a drop of ink in water. The bartender's expression didn't change, but his eyes did. Not much, just a fraction, as though they'd shifted their focus inward instead of outward. "Plenty of those about," he said after a moment. "Folks leave. Weather stays." Elias hesitated. He could lie. Say he'd been anywhere else. But the ledger, the chains, the man beneath the earth with his blank white gaze fixed on the world above, it all pressed against him, wanting to be spoken. "I was in the valley," he said finally, "near a place that used to be called Quimmerch." Silence moved through the pub like an animal. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just subtle. A page flip slowed. A chair scrape paused. One of the men in high-vis took a longer sip than necessary. The bartender looked at him, really looked at him now, searching his face, not for danger, but for intention. "You went down there?" he asked quietly. "Yes." A soft swallow. "How far in?" "To the center." Elias's voice sounded foreign in his own ears. "To the well." There it was. That word had weight. The bartender didn't cross himself or gasp or tell him to leave. Instead, he exhaled slowly, as though someone had finally spoken aloud the name of a long-ignored illness. "My mam grew up near there," he said. "We weren't allowed to walk that way as children. Not after dark. Not in daylight either, if she could help it. Because of the well, because of the stories." He rested his forearms on the bar and leaned closer, his voice lowering into something that belonged to fireplaces and winter evenings. "About yourself." "No." The soup arrived in a deep bowl, carrying the earthy scent of leeks and pepper. It steamed in gentle curls. Elias wrapped his hands around it like an anchor, grateful for the heat, reluctant to disturb whatever fragile bridge had opened between the present and the old, sleeping past. "Go on," he said. The bartender nodded once, more to himself than to Elias, like a man deciding to finally read aloud a letter he's been hiding for decades. "They said the well was older than the parish, older than the boundaries. Farmers found it, or it found them. Depends who you ask. But no one claimed it. Not the church, not the crown. It didn't belong to any man." He spoke slowly, each sentence laid down like a plank across deep water. First, it was just a place to draw water. Cold, clear, good water. Then came the mishaps. A man swore he saw himself driving a cart at dusk, only he was home in bed at the time. A girl walked into the well field and came back pale as milk, refusing to speak of what she'd seen. Dogs wouldn't go near it. Mirrors cracked. "Mirrors?" Elias asked softly. "Aye." The bartender gave a humorless smile. "They say a mirror is a doorway. The well was another. Two sides of the same, whatever you call it. But the real trouble started when people began to talk of the other selves. Not ghosts, not demons, just you, where you shouldn't be. You'd see yourself coming over the hill while you were still lacing your boots, or passing the chapel window while you were washing the floor, and the one you saw wasn't right." "How?" Elias asked, though he already knew. His stomach had already tightened into a cold knot that wouldn't uncoil. No eyes, or rather eyes, but wrong ones. Pale, white, like boiled fish, as though whatever was wearing your face only remembered halfway what sight was meant to be. He paused, letting the image breathe. So the elders made an arrangement. Word spread that there had to be someone beneath, someone to sit at the bottom and keep the reflection down where it belonged. Call him the keeper, call him the guardian, call him what you will. But he sat, and as long as he sat, the water stayed sweet, and the other selves stayed put. Elias swallowed. Who would agree to that? The bartender's gaze shifted to the window, where the rain stitched silver lines into the street. People who'd lost something already. A widower with no children. A man who'd come back from war, more ghost than flesh. A quiet type who didn't mind the dark. They said you drank a little of the water. And after that, it wasn't so hard to stay put. A prickle walked along Elias's arms, lifting the tiny hairs there. And if he left, he whispered. The bartender didn't answer. He didn't need to, because as Elias leaned back in the worn pub chair, the glass behind him, the faint reflection nested in its surface, shifted, just a breath out of sync. He turned his head sharply. His reflection turned a fraction too late. His heart stumbled. The pupils in the reflected eyes were faint-thinned, like watercolor washed once too many times, and for a heartbeat he thought he could see the palest suggestion of white beneath. He blinked. The reflection corrected itself. Brown eyes. Normal. Just him. A man in a pub. Soup cooling on the table. He let out a slow breath through his teeth. You all right? The bartender asked gently. Fine. Elias lead. He finished the soup mechanically. Each spoonful a small ritual designed to keep his hands occupied. The warmth did little to soothe him anymore. He paid, thanked the bartender, and stepped back out into the late afternoon drizzle. The sky had slouched toward evening without asking permission. Streetlights flickered on one by one, islands of yellow in a sea of gray. The air smelled faintly of coal, smoke, and wet asphalt. He caught his reflection again in the side window of his car. This time the other him didn't mimic the movement precisely. When Elias reached for the door handle, his reflection's hand hovered a beat too long in the air. Fingers splayed like something uncertain about how to behave. He pulled his hand back. So did the reflection, but not perfectly. The angle of the wrist was wrong. The knuckles too still. And the eyes, oh, the eyes. White didn't replace brown entirely. Not yet, but it had started. A milkiness clouded the edges of the iris like frost creeping across a window pane. A cold pressure closed around Elias's chest. You're tired. You're imagining things. Mirrors distort. Reflections blur. Stress plays tricks. He clung to every rational scrap, stacking them like sandbags against an incoming tide. He looked again. The reflection smiled. It was minute. Barely there. But the corners of the mouth lifted in a way his own had not. And then, as though indulging him, it matched his expression once more, tight, pale, almost neutral. Stop, Elias said under his breath, as though trying to scold a child he couldn't quite see. He got into the car. He didn't check the rearview mirror this time. He couldn't bear the thought of seeing himself sitting inches behind him, patient and blank and waiting for the moment when the balance tipped. The drive to his rented cottage took 40 minutes. By the time he arrived, night had fully soaked into the sky, leaving only a few faint veins of light along the western horizon. The cottage sat at the end of a narrow lane bordered by dry stone walls that looked as though they'd assembled themselves. A single upstairs window reflected the moonlight like an unblinking eye. Inside, everything looked blessedly ordinary. Scuffed pine table, second-hand sofa, a lampshade slightly crooked. His life distilled into objects. A teapot with a chip in the rim, mugs that never matched, a bookshelf sagging under the weight of photography monographs he'd read a dozen times. He set the camera gently on the table. For a long moment, he simply looked at it. He felt, absurdly, as though it were a mouth, as though, if he pressed the button, it would speak not with words, but with images that would rewrite the inside of his head. He made tea. He didn't taste it. When darkness fully pinned itself across the countryside, he finally gave in. He opened the footage on his laptop, bigger screen, higher resolution. Maybe this time the tricks would reveal themselves. The seams would show. The descent. The stone throat, the bottom, himself, cross-legged in the dark with eyes like blank seashells. He watched the figure breathe. The chest rose, fell, small, steady movements. Alive. He hadn't imagined the blink. The lid slid over white blankness with careful, almost tender grace. Then something new. The hem at the bottom shifted. Not much, just a small adjustment of the shoulders, like a man settling into a more comfortable position. But the movement was wrong. Too smooth, too deliberate, too aware. The wide-eyed reflection tilted its head, just a little, as though listening, as though someone above had said his name. Elias shut the laptop. The silence in the cottage wasn't empty anymore. It was crowded. He felt very suddenly that he wasn't alone. Not in the haunted house sense of a cold hand on the neck, but in the quieter, more intimate way of sensing another breath beneath your own. Another heartbeat sinking itself slowly, lovingly, to match yours. He looked toward the hallway mirror. His reflection stood where it should, but the eyes, the brown had thinned another shade. The pupils looked slightly blurred, diffused in the way ink bleeds when a raindrop falls into it. He raised his hand. So did the reflection. Perfect. He lowered it. So did the reflection. Perfect. Then just as his fingers brushed the frame of the mirror, the reflection raised its hand again, on its own, palm outward. A greeting, a promise, a claim. Elias backed away until the edge of the table touched the backs of his thighs. His heart slammed wildly now. A trapped thing. Through the pounding, one thought returned with slow, dawning horror. Something must always be beneath. He had gone to the well. He had looked down. He had shown his face to the darkness and given it a shape to wear. And now something with wide eyes was practicing how to be him. Lanes. That night, Elias dreamed of water. Not the bright, restless kind that laughs against pebbles or flings itself at cliffs. This water was old, patient. It lay beneath the world the way a bone lies beneath skin, silent and hidden and absolutely necessary. In the dream, he was falling through it slowly, as though the water had thickened into glass and his body were trapped inside it like an insect in amber. Above him, the pale circle of the well mouth grew smaller and smaller until it resembled an eye, wincing shut. And beneath him waited the other. He couldn't see the face clearly. Only the white of the eyes, two small voids in reverse, where there should have been darkness and depth. But instead there was only blankness, a kind of hunger that wasn't cruelty, wasn't malice, simply emptiness in search of a shape. The figure opened its mouth. No sound came out, but Elias woke with the taste of stone and metal on his tongue. He lay there motionless for a while, staring up into the dark, listening to the cottage breathe, the small nocturnal ticks of wood contracting, the wind hesitating around the eaves, a distant owl calling somewhere out beyond the dry stone wall. But beneath those domestic noises was a second layer of sound that didn't belong to the cottage, or the night, or the world above. A faint, rhythmic scrape, metal against stone, a dragging chain. He told himself it was the central heating. Old pipes ghost through walls in strange ways. He told himself it was the wind snagging the gutter. He told himself a great many things, each one dissolving the moment he reached for it. Eventually, he slept again. When morning came, it brought with it a pale, watery light that seeped reluctantly through thin curtains. Elias rose, dressed, and avoided the hallway mirror by a margin of several feet, skirting it like a dangerous shoreline. He didn't trust it anymore. He didn't trust any surface that could hold him. He made toast he didn't eat, tea he didn't drink. His body moved through the small rituals of morning life with the mechanical calm of a diver underwater. Every motion slowed, amplified, disconnected. He told himself he wouldn't look at the footage again. He told himself he meant it. By noon, the laptop was open. The well appeared as though it had been waiting for him. The stone throat, the descent, the sitting figure at the bottom. Familiar now in the way illness becomes familiar after it's worn itself into your days. But something had changed. The Elias beneath the earth was no longer sitting with the calm, monk-like patience of before. His body had tilted slightly forward, chin lowered, as though listening more closely. The white eyes reflected the LED glow with a brightness that felt eager. And the hands, oh, the hands, They were no longer open on the knees. They were curled, lightly, as though testing the memory of fists. Elias shut the window. The room felt smaller. He stood and paced the narrow floorboards until he knew every squeak, every uneven plank. The air inside his chest felt too thin. He needed out. Fresh air, open sky, something vast enough to dilute the pressure that had been gathering around him ever since the chains whispered in the night. He didn't return to the village. Not yet. Instead, he drove out toward the coast, where the land fell away into abrupt cliffs and the sea stretched to the horizon like a sheet of hammered pewter. The wind came off the water in long, heavy breaths, smelling faintly of salt and kelp and rain that hadn't yet fallen. Gulls rode the currents like scraps of torn paper. He walked the coastal path until his calves burned, and the knot in his chest loosened just enough that he could inhale without feeling watched from the inside. For a while, he almost convinced himself he had outrun it. Almost. He stopped near a bend in the path where a weathered bench faced the sea. Someone had carved initials into the slat. M, E, plus H, R. The groove softened by years of exposure. He sat, letting the wind comb through his hair, and closed his eyes. Footsteps approached from behind, soft, unhurried, not seeking to hide, but not intent on announcing themselves either. He opened his eyes and turned. A man stood a few yards down the path, facing the same direction as Elias, looking out over the vast, indifferent ocean. For a few seconds, Elias only registered the ordinary details. Similar height, similar coat length, similar muddy jeans. A stranger, a walker, someone who'd paused for a breath. Then the man turned his head, and Elias's heart slowed into a long, deep, aching beat. He was looking at his own face, not the wide-eyed version. Not yet. This mirror still wore the familiar brown of iris, and pupil but lighter, thinner, as though the color were draining slowly, spiraling toward extinction. The man smiled, not kindly, not cruelly, just correctly. He smiled the way Elias smiled when he wanted to reassure someone else that everything was fine. Elias tried to speak. Nothing came. The wind pressed cold hands against both of them, tugging at collars, threading fingers through their hair, and it was this shared choreography with the elements that made the world tilt. When the gale pushed, both their coats rippled in the exact same moment. When a gust lifted one curl of Elias's fringe, it lifted the corresponding curl on the other man too. A perfect duet, except for the eyes. The other Elias blinked, and when the eyelids reopened, the irises had paled another shade like tea diluted again and again until only a ghost of flavor remained. "Don't," Elias whispered, though he couldn't have said what he was pleading against. "Don't come closer. Don't become me. Don't erase the boundary between here and below." But the other man didn't move. He didn't need to, because Elias understood with a clarity so sudden it felt like a blade sliding ice cold between ribs that the boundary wasn't there on the path. It was inside him. A fine, invisible line had been drawn the moment he lowered the camera into the well. A thread had been passed between him and the watcher like a stitch, and now, slowly, patiently, something below was pulling on that thread, drawing them closer with the same inevitability that water finds the lowest place to rest. He staggered back. The other Elias did not. He remained exactly where he was, as though pinned in place by the great sky overhead. And then impossibly, gently he lifted a hand in greeting, a mirror greeting, a farewell, a promise. Elias Wren, not fast, not theatrically, just with the quiet, desperate urgency of a man who knows that he is no longer fully alone inside his own skin. The path blurred beneath his boots. The wind turned harsh and insistent, dragging against his progress like sea-tangled weeds. He didn't look back. He couldn't. When he reached the cottage, dusk had already begun its slow descent, painting the world in long blue shadows that filled corners like water in a basin. The hallway mirror waited faithfully, catching a fragment of his movement and returning it to him like a message in a bottle. He avoided it. He went upstairs. The bathroom mirror was smaller. He forced himself to look. The face that stared back belonged, mostly, to him. But the pupils, those familiar black voids that anchored the world, had begun their retreat. White bled in from the edges, soft and cloudy. like milk poured slowly into ink. He pressed his palms to the sink and leaned forward until his breath fogged the glass, turning his reflection into a smear of shadow and suggestion. "I'm still here," he whispered. It came out like a question. Behind him, in the blurred reflection of the hallway, a second shape moved, slowly, with purpose. He spun around. The landing was empty, only the mirror, and the moth-soft lamplight, and the quiet of the house. But the scrape of chains sounded again, closer now. Not beneath the world, but somewhere just behind the plaster, inside the bones of the house itself. Metal, stone, movement. He backed away until the bed caught him behind the knees and he sat heavily, shoulders sagging. He wanted absurdly, achingly, to call someone, to speak this out loud, to anchor it to another mind so it would stop echoing only in his. But what would he say? "Hello. There's a version of me living at the bottom of a forgotten well, wearing my face like a memory that's starting to fray, and he's getting closer every day." He laughed, a small, broken sound that dissolved almost immediately into the hush. Outside, night settled, fully a soft, dark animal curling itself around the cottage. The world narrowed to a circle of lamplight. The shadows thickened into something with gravity. He didn't see the exact moment the boundary broke. He only noticed the result. He turned some small domestic instinct, some idle movement, and there, in the doorway of the bedroom, he stood. Not in the mirror, not in the glass, but in the room, solid enough that the worn carpet depressed slightly beneath his boots, real enough that the lamplight caught the faint line of a scar above the eyebrow, a bicycle accident from childhood, and ran along it like a finger tracing old history. The eyes were almost completely white now, like seashells washed clean by 100 tides. They weren't blind. They understood him. They drank him in. For a long, fire-hot second, the two men simply looked at each other. The cottage might as well have fallen away. The hills, the road, the well, the world. Everything collapsed down to this quiet room and the two versions of one man inside it. The wide-eyed Elias tilted his head, perfectly, gently, as though imitating a gesture he had practiced many times in the deep, cold dark beneath the earth. And when he smiled, it was tender, almost kind, as if to say, "You've been carrying this a long time. Let me sit for a while." Elias opened his mouth. His throat worked. No sound came. The wide-eyed reflection took a single step forward. It was enough. The room changed. The air thickened, not visibly, not violently, just enough that Elias felt the weight of it in his lungs. The scrape of chains echoed softly, but there were no chains in the room. No stone, no water, only carpet and wood and the faint distant sound of the sea beyond the hills. But the echo belonged here now. It had crossed over. Something must always be beneath, and something had left its seat. Gray dull. For a long time, neither of them moved. Two silhouettes in a small Welsh bedroom. One breathing quickly, shallow and frantic. The other breathing slowly, deeply, like a man who had finally come in from the cold. Elias found that if he didn't blink, if he stared into those white, depthless eyes without interruption, the rest of the world faded a little. The outline of the door softened. The lamp dimmed. The bed beneath him lost its edges. There was only the gaze, and behind that gaze, stone. He could feel it. The temperature of the dream water crept into his bones again. He remembered the parish ledger someone must always sit beneath. He remembered the scratched words inked by hands that had trembled with the burden of knowledge. If the watcher leaves his seat, the water turns. "Don't," Elias whispered, barely sound at all. A thought escaping through his lips. The wide-eyed man didn't answer. He didn't seem capable of speech in the way Elias understood it. But there was communication in the small tilt of his head, in the strange compassion of his expression. Not "let me out," not "I want your life." Just, you know how it works. Something must always be beneath. And for the first time since Quem March, Elias understood the mechanism, simple as gravity. There were not two separate beings, one above and one below. There was one life, and the world demanded balance. One consciousness could be divided only so long before it sought to reconcile itself above and beneath, surface and shadow. The well wasn't haunted. It was a machine, a hinge, a turning point between what lives in memory and what walks in flesh. And he had opened it. The figure stepped closer. The room didn't shake. The light didn't flicker. His heart did not explode with terror. Instead, a kind of peaceful numbness began to spread through Elias, starting at the base of his spine and unfurling upward like cold smoke. It felt inevitable, like a tide nudging a boat away from shore, like time, like the end of winter. He wanted to run, and he couldn't remember how. The wide-eyed version of him stopped just out of reach, close enough that Elias could see the faint sheen of moisture on his brow, the individual lashes framing the pale orbs, the way the skin at the corners of his eyes crinkled exactly as Elias's did when he tried to smile through exhaustion. He lifted a hand. So did Elias, not in imitation, but because it was impossible not to, because the gesture was a magnet, and his own arm was iron. Their palms met, warm skin, real, solid, and in that instant, Elias felt the floor vanish. Not literally, the cottage was still there. The carpet, the lamplight, the walls. But inside him, something gave way. He was falling and sinking and sitting all at once, as though he were being folded inward like paper. Stone closed around him. Cold air kissed the back of his neck. Chains whispered. He was there at the bottom of the well, knees folded beneath him, hands resting gently on his thighs. The world above existed only as a faint circle of light far, far away. And he was calm, more calm than he had been in years. The wide-eyed figure was gone from the cottage doorway, because there was no longer a boundary between the two versions. There was only placement. He belonged here now. He understood that in the same way the sea understands the pull of the moon. Wordlessly, without argument, he could hear the water beneath the stone, could smell the deep metallic tang of iron and old rain, could feel like the ghost of a memory the echo of the camera's light drifting down once upon a time to meet him. He blinked. He could blink, and when his eyelids opened again, they did not meet darkness. They met awareness. Above, life continued. The cottage, the hills, the roads ribboning through the countryside, and somewhere up there now walked a man wearing his face, with eyes the proper brown of the surface world, pupils ink dark and sure of their place. The seated Elias thought or half thought of this man, the reflection, the walker, and felt no anger, only the steady weight of duty. It was a simple arrangement. One sits, one lives. He did not know how long had passed when he first became aware of the sound soft, distant, like a heartbeat echoing down a corridor. Footsteps, careful ones, curious ones, the kind that belonged to someone with a camera bag slung over his shoulder, moving through wet grass and old stone lanes toward a village he'd heard once in a story. Perhaps in a pub, perhaps online, the kind of footsteps that always found their way to the old well in the end. Elias, the Elias below, did not sigh. Sitting was not a burden anymore. It was a location, a state of being. But somewhere far above, 3 rusted chains trembled, almost imperceptibly, like a warning bell whose sound had been worn down to a whisper. A shadow darkened the circle of sky. A face leaned over the rim, young, eager, alive. The seated Elias lifted his white eyes, and in the deep, eternal quiet beneath the world, he felt the old, patient gravity of the place begin to work again. Because the story was never about monsters. It was about balance, and about the terrible things that can happen when you look down into the dark, and the dark looks back up and recognizes you. As America's Unweighted, for more. Ending. Reflection. Radio. Soft. If you ever find yourself in an abandoned village where the houses sag like tired shoulders and the grass grows tall enough to whisper secrets, you might come across an old stone well with 3 chains rusting into the decades. You might feel curious. You might lean over. And if the water doesn't reflect you, if something else does, you should probably leave. Because someone always has to sit in the dark so that the rest of us can walk under open sky. And the well never forgets a face, the unclaimed relic. There is a certain kind of quiet that belongs only to government buildings after dark. A quiet made from the hum of neglected strip lights, the whir of budget ventilation systems, and the faint, constant sigh of thousands of archived objects settling into the weight of their own dust. Noah Calder had grown fond of that quiet. The evidence retention facility sat 3 levels below a police administrative building in East London. A warren of windowless corridors and locked steel doors, painted in a color that might once have been white but had aged into a weary shade of nicotine. Noah often joked softly to himself, because few others ever came down here, that the walls had inhaled too many unsolved cases and were now stained from the inside out. He worked a late shift, not because he had to, because the quiet suited him. You don't get to 41 with a life like his, half-finished degrees, a dissolved engagement, a flat that never felt quite unpacked, without learning that some people simply belonged among forgotten things. He processed, logged, archived. His job was to tidy the aftermath of other people's catastrophes. He liked the structure, the order, the certainty that everything had a label and a place to go. But sometimes, the past sent unfiled items back, and those were the ones that stayed with him. It came in on a Thursday afternoon, rolled down on a dolly by a courier wearing a bright orange vest that felt almost obscene under the sickly fluorescence. "Historic transfer," the man said, glancing at the clipboard as though it might argue back. "Met property custody. Recovered from archive storage. Been sat in a county facility up north since the 50s, apparently. You're the lucky winner." "And that, Mike's?" The crate was small, perhaps the size of a hat box, but heavy. The wood was blackened with age and varnish, the grain almost invisible beneath the patina of handling. A tarnished brass plate was screwed into the side, the engraving worn nearly smooth. Noah leaned closer. "Exhibit 1847-11. Acquisition unknown." He frowned. Most exhibits had context, case numbers, victim names, officer signatures. This one was a ghost, an orphaned relic that had slipped between record-keeping systems for over a century and a half. "Signed for?" the courier prompted. "Yeah," Noah murmured, scrawling his name. "Cheers." When the dolly rattled away, the box remained a little black gravity at the center of the room. Noah wheeled it to an empty stainless steel work table beneath the harsh white light, logged it into the digital chain of custody system, and began the slow work of opening the outer crate. The wood groaned. The nails cried out softly as they were persuaded free. Inside, wrapped in layers of rotting canvas and brittle brown paper, lay a smaller chest. This one was different. It was carved from dark wood the color of dried blood, the surface intricately etched with repeating symbols that Noah's mind kept trying and failing to categorize. They weren't quite runes, not quite letters. They unsettled the eye, as though they'd been designed to be remembered incorrectly, and they were bound tightly by 3 lengths of thin braided copper chain. The chain wasn't decorative. It wasn't looped. It was wound, methodically, like ligatures around a wound that refused to close. Each loop had been soldered permanently sealed so that removing it would require tools, approval, paperwork, signatures. There was no modern custody label, only an inked tag, tied through a hole in the wood with twine turned fragile as a spider web. The handwriting was Victorian, neat, furious. "Do not unbind. Metropolitan Police, 1893. Noah let out a small breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Well," he murmured to the empty room. "That's promising." He took several photos, evidence intake protocol, and began drafting a notation for the database. "Unidentified historical exhibit. Wooden box. Copper chain binding. Condition. Stable. Audio devices to be stored separately." Audio devices. The phrase lingered in his head like a bell tone. There were none here, of course. Just shelves of sealed case files, racks of ziplocked items, rows of tagged weapons, seized electronics that still carried the faint warmth of the lives they'd been pulled from. But something inside the box, if there even was anything inside, tugged at his attention, the way a draft tugs at a loose paper. A suggestion. A pressure. He ignored it. He was good at ignoring the pull of things. He logged the chest, carried it with both hands to the deep storage section, and placed it gently in a numbered steel cubby. The copper chains chimed faintly against the metal, a sound like someone stirring a spoon through thick syrup. Then he locked the door, turned off the lights, went upstairs. The facility closed to the day staff, and the night learned the shape of the new arrival. Now, knees go mad. The first oddity was small, almost amusing. "That's 4 shoot tonight." The old police radio that sat dormant on the corner desk, a relic itself, long disconnected from any active frequency switched on. No click, no crackle, No dead carrier tone, just soft chanting. The sound spilled into the room like warm smoke, low-pitched, rhythmic. The syllables rounded and unfamiliar. The structure of language was there, but none of the meaning. It felt old. Older than the building. Older than the city. Older than the idea of laws cataloging wrongs. Noah froze mid-stride. He had been making tea, moving through his familiar orbit of mugs and kettles, half asleep in the comfort of routine. He stared at the radio. It didn't belong to any channel. It didn't belong to anything. Barukana Threnaru. The voice was not quite male, not quite female. It felt distant, not like a person speaking into a microphone, but like the echo of a choir trapped in a narrow, stone-walled room. He approached. He prickled the back of his neck, like the air before lightning. "All right," he said gently, as though addressing a nervous animal. "Who's having a laugh?" He turned the dials. Nothing changed. He pulled the power. The chanting didn't stop. If anything, it grew clearer. The syllables fell into rhythm with his heartbeat. The tea went cold in his hand. He turned very slowly toward the deep storage cubbies. He didn't need to open them. He knew. The sound, that strange, impossible language, wasn't coming from the radio anymore. It was answering the radio, from inside the copper-bound box. A thought surfaced unbidden, not in his own voice. You do not bind metal around wood unless you are afraid of what the wood remembers. He swallowed. "Stop," he whispered. The chanting didn't stop. It invited, like a tide whispering to a loose stone, like a locked door leaning ever so slightly ajar, waiting for a hand to finish the motion. For hours, the building filled and emptied with sound, sometimes faint, sometimes rising to a soft, steady drone that vibrated the fluorescent bulbs. Noah walked the aisles of shelving with the quiet reverence of a man in a place of worship. Not his faith, not anyone's. Yet, by dawn, the radio fell silent. The building remembered its bureaucracy. The kettles, the computers, the paper records all behaved as they should again. But something had shifted in Noah's head, because the chant, the cadence, if not the meaning, remained under his thoughts, behind the day, waiting. So is. He did not open the box. Not that first night. Not the second. He told himself he was obeying procedure. He told himself that there would be forms first. Authorizations, supervisory clearance, risk assessments. That it wasn't his place to investigate. But the chants worked the way waves work on stone, with patience. By the fourth night, the radios weren't the only devices speaking. The desktop computer, decades newer than the radio, woke itself from sleep at 3:11 a.m., screen blooming from black into a pale, luminous rectangle. No system login, no boot logo, just text, slender black characters arranged into lines that pulsed gently, as though breathing. The language was the same as the chant. Curves and hooks and unfamiliar sigils marched across the screen like an army of ants. Noah stared. The text rearranged itself, line by slow line. Not translating that would have been too easy, but simplifying. The way a mind sometimes rearranges a dream until you realize it is describing you. His lips parted. He found himself trying silently to shape the sounds. Half-formed syllables brushed the inside of his mouth like moth wings. Arukana. He tasted copper. He flinched. The sound stopped. The screen went black. The room exhaled. He sat alone at the desk, heart racing, tea forgotten, the smell of old paper and ozone filling his lungs, and he knew two things with dreadful clarity. The relic did not want to be forgotten. It had found a new way to speak. He shut everything down. He went home at dawn the way night workers always have, blinking into a city that was already fully awake, feeling like a ghost in reverse. He dreamed of mirrors, made of metal, broad, shallow discs of bronze, polished until they could show a face back the way a lake shows the sky. Only in his dream, when he leaned close enough that his breath clouded the surface, the reflection whispered back, not in echo, but in greeting. He woke with the chant in his throat. Not out loud, not yet, just there, ready, like a word he'd been about to say and forgotten. But heaven ups. He lasted until the 8th night, until the chanting, the text, the gentle rhythmic pulse of language that had outlived empire and faith and country, all aligned into something almost human. That night, he walked slowly, quietly, through the rows of shelves and cubbies to the one that held the copper-bound box. He didn't bring tools. He didn't bring authority. He brought curiosity and the faint, aching sense that whatever was inside already knew his name. He rested his hands lightly on the cold copper chains. They were warm, ever so slightly, like metal that had been held or breathed on. "Who owned you?" he whispered, absurdly. In answer, the chant rose not louder, but closer, as though a mouth had moved nearer to his ear from the inside of the box. Noah closed his eyes. Half of him, the part that remembered caution, remembered rules, remembered the quiet domestic tools of a life that had once been simple, wanted to step back, log a security alert, call upstairs, write a full incident report. The other half, the half that lived among forgotten things, felt the weight of centuries pressing softly into his palms. He began to unwind the chain. 2 furs. To playing doozer. Copper sings when you disturb it. Not loud, not like iron ringing when struck, but softly, like a throat clearing in another room. When Noah unwound the first loop of chain, the sound was barely more than a sigh, a faint, metallic hush that rippled invisibly through the warehouse and returned to settle somewhere behind his ribs. He paused. He waited for the guilt to arrive, the familiar, bureaucratic panic of a man breaking procedure after years of routine. But instead he felt lighter, as though a weight he hadn't known he was carrying had shifted from one hand to another. The chanting didn't get louder. It simply became more precise. What had once sounded like a distant choir now resolved into individual voices, layers, tones, some low and patient, others higher, thinner, like someone singing inside a long clay jar, and beneath those, something deeper than sound, a rhythm older than language. His fingers resumed their work. The second loop loosened. The copper was warm now. Not hot, not alarming, just body warm, as though it had been held against skin. His breath shortened. His mind, usually steady, sensible. A place of lists and labels began to fold in on itself the way paper does when damp. Thoughts didn't vanish. They blurred. The chant slid between them, threading meaning where none had existed. Ahru, Kana, Tal, Arim. He didn't know the words, but he recognized the feeling of being remembered. The last loop resisted not physically, but as though the air itself thickened around his hands. For a long moment he stood there, fingertips resting on the copper, the soft buzzing hum of the ceiling lights laying a trembling counterpoint beneath the chant. He could stop. He could rewind the chain, call a supervisor, send a report that would be skimmed and set aside and never fully believed. Instead, he unwound the final coil. The chain fell slack. Something in the room exhaled. He slid the copper gently aside and looked properly, fully at the box for the first time. The carved symbols crawled under the light, not moving, but never quite staying where the eye left them. The wood felt less like timber and more like compressed time. The lid wasn't nailed. It wasn't even fitted. It rested. All that effort, decades of binding, had been meant to stop someone from lifting something that weighed almost nothing at all. With the kind of care one normally reserves for the recently dead, Noah lifted the lid. The chanting stopped. Silence fell with a weight he could feel on his shoulders. Inside the box, nested in faded black velvet that had gone stiff with age, lay a mirror. Not glass, bronze or something like it, polished to a dull, lunar glow. The surface wasn't perfectly smooth. Faint ripples caught the light and sent it drifting like oil across water. A narrow border of symbols ringed the disc, the same repeating sigils from the box, worn into the metal as though by centuries of handling. It was not beautiful. It was not sinister. It simply was. Old in a way nothing made by human hands should be allowed to remain. Noah's reflection ghosted faintly across the surface, distorted, elongated, his eyes seeming too large, the pupils soft at the edges. He leaned closer, not quite meaning to. The mirror didn't become brighter. The world behind him simply dimmed. Shelving in concrete and strip light retreated into a kind of non-space, like scenery in a theater before the spotlight finds the actors. The mirror filled his field of vision. His breath fogged the surface. For the smallest moment, he thought he saw the fog move in the opposite direction, as though the mirror exhaled when he inhaled. He should have put the lid back on. He should have rebound the chains. He didn't. He only whispered, "What are you?" And the mirror answered, not with sound, with understanding. A whisper formed at the back of his mind, not in English, not in syllables, but in meaning shapes. If thought could hum, if memory could be sung, it would sound like this. I am how you look at the part of yourself that does not belong to the present day. Images came with the thought. Hands dozens, hundreds holding the mirror in turn. Hands darker, lighter, scarred, ringed with jewels, smeared with earth, calloused from rowing, stained with ink. A woman in a linen shroud speaking quietly to it before being buried. A priest holding it to the mouth of a dying king. Children forced to look into it while a man in red cloth chanted nearby, their small reflections trembling like moths. And always, always, the chant. Ahru Kana Tal Arim. The words pressed gently against the inside of his skull, trying to practice themselves in a modern throat. Noah blinked. His reflection didn't, for a breath-long eternity. It looked back with the stillness of a painting. Then delicately it copied the motion. A beat too late. He swallowed. The room returned around him. Shelves, crates. The low throb of electricity through wires, but only as decoration. The true world was the mirror now, and the strange soft weight of the chant nestling itself into the grooves of his mind. He closed the lid, not out of strength, out of necessity. The sound resumed at once, not louder than before, closer, like breath fogging the inside of a mask that has already been placed over the face. He rewound the copper chain, slowly, reverently, as though tucking a sleeping child back into bed. His hands didn't shake. He expected them to. He replaced the box in its cubby. He logged the time. He washed his hands afterward. Twice, though he wasn't sure why. The water ran pinkish for a moment, though there was no cut, no mark, no reason for it to do so. The sound of the tap pitched itself unconsciously into the cadence of the chant. Aru, Kana. He shut it off. Silence. But the silence wasn't empty anymore. It had contours. He went home at dawn. The morning outside felt thinner. The busker on the corner sang a song he didn't recognize, but the rhythm fell perfectly into the same pattern. A child's skipping rope slapped the pavement in ritual time. The announcer on the underground train paused between syllables like a priest dividing lines of scripture. For a while, it was almost funny. Then it wasn't. We have gathering, but if we suppose, then right. The first surrender came without ceremony. Noah was making tea in his flat, kettle purring contentedly on the hob. A faint London drizzle traced crooked lines down the kitchen window, blurring the city into watercolor. He stood there, mug in hand, half watching the steam rise, half nowhere at all. The chant surfaced like a fish breaking water. Not loud, not foreign, familiar. His lips parted, and before he could stop himself, before he even fully realized it was happening, he spoke. Just one syllable, barely shaped. Or it tasted like metal and rain. He clapped a hand over his mouth. The quiet afterward was the kind that follows confession. His heart raced. He waited for panic. Instead, a strange warmth spread across his chest, the same warmth the copper had held. A quiet approval. Not external, not intrusive, as though a part of him he had never bothered to know finally had a word for itself. He slept poorly, dreams of bronze, of a mirror held over faces, collecting last breaths, of a language spoken not to command but to remember. In the morning, his voice felt different in his throat, not deeper, not changed, simply shared. The second surrender happened at work. He didn't mean to go back to the cubby. His feet carried him as reliably as they always had toward the kettle, the filing desk, the archive terminal, but the chant turned those routes ever so slightly, like a river eroding its banks, until the course shifts enough to be noticed. He stood before the copper-bound box as a congregant might stand before an altar not expecting miracle, simply acknowledging presence. I won't open you, he murmured. The chant pulsed softly. The overhead lights flickered in agreement with nothing at all. He rested one hand on the lid, not lifting it, not daring, not quite, and felt a face, not physically, not as touch, but as knowing, The mirror didn't show you what you were now. It showed you the part of yourself the present day had buried. And then it taught that part a language. Noah closed his eyes. He saw himself at different ages, boy, man, older shadow, each holding the same bronze disc, each learning the same sounds. A lineage without blood, a faith without scripture, a torch passed down through the mouth. Something inside him knelt, just a little, just enough. He left the chains intact that day. He didn't need to open the box anymore. The mirror knew his face now. The language knew his lungs. That night, when the radio began its soft, endless chant again, unbidden, unplugged, impossible, Noah didn't flinch. He listened. He repeated, quietly at first, then with care, then eventually with accuracy. His tongue learned the shapes. His palate remembered what his mind could not translate. He did not understand the words in any dictionary sense, but he understood the obedience of rhythm, like breath, like prayer, like sleep. And the city, for all its noise and light and denial, felt suddenly like a thin film of new paint over a wall full of old script. He could almost see through it. Almost. But thanks for watching, and had only bien. By the time the others noticed, it was too late to say this was merely influence. A colleague, a young constable assigned to deliver a batch of seized hard drives, found Noah at his desk around 3 a.m, sitting perfectly still, eyes open, mouth moving, barely perceptible. Baru, kana, tal. Her report later would say. He didn't look mad. He didn't look distressed. He looked devoted. She asked if he was all right. He looked up, smiled. Only his voice when he answered wasn't his own. It carried a subtle undertone. A second voice braided beneath the first, like harmony in a song sung under the breath. It wasn't a trick of echo. It wasn't the room. It was the mirror speaking through a mouth that had begun, at last, to listen. He said, "I'm almost ready," and then went back to work, filing, cataloging, whispering, learning. Man's to go. There comes a point subtle, almost tender, when influence becomes infrastructure. Not something added to your life, something your life begins to grow around. For Noah, that point arrived quietly. He did not feel possessed. He did not feel controlled. He simply felt accompanied. The chanting had softened into a constant backdrop, a barely audible pressure in the air like static, or the thrum of power lines. Even when the room appeared silent, the silence had a shape, and he could feel the edges of the shape brushing the back of his mind like a cat winding around his ankles in the dark. It didn't beg. It didn't demand. It simply was. And you cannot argue with gravity. And now, too violent. The first sign that the mirror no longer required opening came 2 nights after the constable found him whispering. Noah was working through a backlog of property reports, the kind of clerical tide that normally swallowed hours whole. Names, dates, barcodes, case numbers that meant far more to someone else than they ever would to him. He typed. The fluorescent lights hummed above, tired and yellowing. At 1:46 a.m., the printer woke up. He hadn't sent a job. No one else was in the building. Still, the machine stirred like a sleeper, responding to a whispered name. Its rollers whined faintly, and a blank page stuttered out, then another, each one carrying lines of black script. The same script. That wandering language that had once confined itself to the computer screen now walked across paper. The fonts didn't match any installed software. The characters were hand-drawn but mechanically perfect strokes even. Spacing, exact, alignment unsettling in its precision. Line after line filled with those strange sigils that had hovered on the edge of comprehension for days. Noah stood, approached, lifted the first sheet as though it might burn him. His name appeared midway down the page. Written correctly. Noah Calder. Perfect English. Perfect print. Then without transition, the script resumed beneath it, folding around his name the way ivy folds around an old stone gatepost. He did not understand the words, but he understood, with a shudder that started somewhere behind his ribs and rippled outward, that the language had recognized him. Context, placement, identity, and it had begun to write him in. He stacked the pages carefully, as though each carried a thin coat of volatile chemicals. The papers smelled faintly of dust and warm plastic, and something else, a metallic tang that reminded him of the chains. of the bronze, of the sound the mirror made when it wasn't speaking aloud. He held the stack against his chest and felt seen. When I threw down, from then on, the facility began to learn the chant the way a building learns to creak in bad weather. The radio woke itself nightly. The computer's screensaver grew faint, ripples the hint of bronze. Sometimes the hard drives hummed in rhythm. Sometimes the overhead lights flickered in time. And once, only once, Noah swore he saw his reflection in the dark window at the far end of the room, even though there was no glass there. Only cinder block painted municipal beige. He did not tell anyone. He did not feel trapped. He felt like a man who had discovered a small door in the world that no one else seemed willing to open, and the responsibility, if that was the word, curled warm and heavy around his mind. Right into it. But the mirror was not content to remain a secret between itself and the few broken machines. It was not angry. It was patient. Patience, after all, was the only luxury time always afforded itself. So it began to grow, not physically, in permission. The chant, once constrained to devices, now seeped into room tone. The soft recorded hush audio engineers listened to between dialogue cuts, except there were no recordings here. Only the physical fact of sound that shouldn't be. Sometimes the chant arrived behind his own thoughts, like a backing choir waiting for a cue. Sometimes it rode on the breath of the air conditioning. Sometimes on the footsteps of the officers upstairs. And sometimes, most disquietingly, it arrived from his own voice. He would be speaking normally. Archive reference 639 Omega. And a second, softer strand of syllables would coil beneath the English like a harmony thread. Ahrukanatal. He would stop. The English would stop. But the other voice, quiet, careful, unbelievably polite, would finish the sentence in the language of the mirror. Not aloud, not with vocal cords, but inside the cavity of his skull. He learned to let it, not out of weakness, out of etiquette. There are some languages that resent being interrupted. Okay, so get us off. On the 10th night, he returned to deep storage. Not compulsively, not feverishly, calmly. He unlocked the gate, walked the aisle, and stood before the copper-bound chest the way a parishioner stands in the hour before dawn, waiting for the first bell. He did not open it. He didn't need to. He simply laid both palms flat upon the copper, feeling that faint, living warmth, and listened. The chant did not come from the box. It came from his own breath. The small, involuntary exhale, barely sound-formed syllables he had never consciously learned. He leaned closer. His reflection did not exist here. There was no glass. And yet, with his eyes closed, he could feel the mirror's presence, as though an attentive face were hovering just inches from his own. Mouthing the same words in time, he spoke softly, reverently, like a man practicing a prayer before saying it in front of others. Ahrukana. Tal. The syllables landed gently, like feathers, and then something answered. It was not a sound. It was not a feeling. It was agreement, as though a choir 1,000 years dead had nodded in unison. Noah opened his eyes. The copper had grown warmer beneath his hands. His fingertips tingled with the faintest vibration, not shaking, not buzzing, more like purring, and gently, invisibly. The boundary between where he ended and the language began tilted, just a fraction, but enough, by interest to rights. Heinz. The city outside did not change. Buses still hissed to curbs. Sirens still split the night. Pigeons still argued on rooftops like old men in a park. Yet Noah began to notice an undercurrent. Snatches of overheard conversations in shops, in cafes, in the corridors upstairs sometimes rearranged themselves in his mind into chant cadence. The timetables on train station boards flickered in patterns that felt like verses. The slow, steady blinking of pedestrian crossing signals began to feel like ritual punctuation. Once, standing at a zebra crossing in Camden, he caught his reflection faintly in a puddle at his feet, distorted by oil and rain, and for a heartbeat, his reflected lips moved in a rhythm his own mouth had not yet chosen. He laughed, softly, not with mockery, with recognition. The mirror had learned him. Now, it was beginning to teach the world what it had already taught him. The last things. The third surrender was not vocal. It was architectural. One evening near closing, the facility lights cut out. They did that sometimes, budget wiring, aging circuits. Storms somewhere above ground dragging their knuckles across the city's power grid. Noah didn't panic. He knew the layout by heart. The room held its breath, and in that darkness, pure, unbroken, velvety, the chant did not rise. Instead, light did. Not illumination, not brightness. Something subtler. Like the dark itself had learned reflective properties. Shapes became suggestions. Edges glowed faintly, bronze and soft, like the last smear of sunset across a tarnished plate. He could see without seeing the broad disk of the mirror hovering at the heart of the room, even though the box remained physically closed. It wasn't present, but it wasn't absent either. The mirror was wherever the language was, and the language was now everywhere that Noah listened. The emergency lighting kicked back in with a resentful flicker. The vision collapsed. He was alone again with the harsh fluorescence, the filing system, the quiet hum of the HVAC, but he did not doubt what he had glimpsed. You do not doubt gravity the first time you fall. You only recognize its jurisdiction. Ryan knew it was around this time, people began to avoid him. Not consciously. They were civil. Polite. They made the usual small talk about football scores and tube delays and the way the rain made everything smell like iron and mildew. But their eyes slid off him. Conversations ended a beat earlier than expected. A desk that had never been tidy now remained mysteriously clean. Paperwork delivered discreetly in neat piles, as though reluctant to physically cross his shadow. And once after he'd walked past the reception area upstairs, he heard a civilian clerk murmur to another. He hums. All the time. You ever notice? Like church but not church. Noah smiled without bitterness. He did hum. He couldn't help it. The melody didn't belong to any scale. It drifted. Like fog. Like breath on glass. Like the echo of a long-forgotten service in a language the parishioners never fully understood but still felt comforted to repeat. And callers. And callers. And callers. Then the mirror refused silence altogether. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday, when Noah was halfway through entering serial numbers into the intake system. He paused to stretch his fingers, those narrow archivist's hands that had turned 1,000 pages, sealed 1,000 evidence bags, and now remembered the warmth of ancient copper better than the touch of another human being. The computer screen blinked, then blinked again. Not a glitch, a rhythm. The cursor at the end of the text field began to pulse 3 slow flashes. 2 quick, 3 slow, and the hairs along Noah's arms lifted as though a draft had passed through the sealed room. He leaned closer. The message appeared. Not in English, not in code. The language. Clean, sharp, beautiful in its own way. He didn't know how he knew this, but he knew. The mirror was asking a question. Not demanding, not insisting, just asking. The question didn't live in words, not yet. It lived in invitation. Like a priest holding out a bowl and waiting to see whether you would kneel. Noah's fingers hovered over the keyboard. His pulse sang in his throat, and gently, reverently, he began to type. Not English, not letters, but shapes. The language flowed out of him, like a muscle memory he had never earned. Characters marched into neat lines, each one fitting the next as naturally as breath follows breath. He did not understand, but he answered. And somewhere in a place where bronze never tarnishes and languages do not die, something old and patient realized that the world had, at last, produced another voice fluent enough to be worth teaching. The printer stirred. The radios sighed. The quiet room leaned forward as though listening, and Noah, polite, orderly, ordinary Noah felt the first faint touch of worship bloom inside his chest. No, there are D's. There is a difference, a delicate, almost invisible difference between repeating a language and belonging to it. Repeating requires effort. Belonging does not. It was a Thursday, or at least the calendar said so. Noah had begun to lose the sharp edges around days, as though time had been sanded down to a soft curve. People came, people went. Keys rattled, doors closed, and beneath it all, the chant kept its patient rhythm. He no longer resisted speaking. He didn't intend to speak either. He simply found that when he opened his mouth to say anything at all, the language was already there, like breath, like saliva, like the small unconscious noises humans make when standing up from a low chair. One evening, as he logged a collection of seized jewelry into the database, the first full sentence arrived. It didn't push. It didn't cease. It asked. He paused over the keyboard. The sentence formed itself in his throat like a prayer recited too many times to forget. Arukanatalarim. Esan. The last word trembled with some emotion that had no English equivalent. Something adjacent to pity. Something adjacent to correction. He didn't speak it aloud, but his breath did, very softly. So softly that if anyone else had been in the room, and no one ever was, not really, they might have thought he was sighing. The mirror did not glow. The copper did not sing. But the room changed. Just a fraction. The way a face changes when a listener leans forward because they've realized the story isn't a story anymore, it's a confession. Noah wet his lips. They did not feel like his. Not in the way ownership normally feels. More like a handover. A shared jurisdiction. He began to speak more often after that, quietly, unobtrusively, the syllables threading themselves through the ordinary business of evidence storage. It wasn't frenzy. It wasn't mania. It was practice. Because the language, whatever it had been once, wherever it had grown, however many centuries it had outlasted, had a shape meant to live inside a mouth. And Noah's mouth, through repetition and devotion and the soft surrender of loneliness, had finally become the right shape. The mirror didn't need to be seen anymore. It had been housed. We're getting potus. The first time the world outside responded. Noah was on the bus home. A late service. Almost empty. Rain fingering its way down the windows like writing he couldn't quite read. The bus jolted. The driver muttered an apology. A woman in a headscarf adjusted the strap of her shopping bag and stared out into the night. Noah watched his reflection in the glass, the layered doubling of himself against the city, sodium lights carving tired hollows under his eyes. He exhaled, quietly. The chant rode the breath without asking permission. Aruka. The woman across the aisle turned her head, not sharply, not startled, simply aware. Her gaze did not quite meet his. It hovered near the space where his breath had been, as though she'd heard something familiar but couldn't quite remember when or where she'd last heard it. Her lips parted, only for a heartbeat. Then she blinked, adjusted her grip on the bag, and went back to the window. The bus continued. The night folded over the moment like a blanket, but Noah felt the hinge tilt again, that quiet inner mechanism that had begun, day by day, to reassign ownership of his voice. He did not feel frightened. He felt useful. There is a strange, seductive relief in realizing that your life, all of its accumulated silence, all of its unremarkable days, has finally been given a purpose, even if that purpose remains largely unnamed. Noah had been a custodian his entire career. Now he was a custodian of something older than custody. Now the ritual when it came did not announce itself. There were no candles, no robes, no arcane symbols chalked onto floors. It crept into the ordinary workday like rain creeping into brickwork. A small email arrived from property control, a reminder about an upcoming audit. Keys jingled on their hooks. Somewhere upstairs, laughter burst and faded. The normal business of a city trying to keep itself from coming apart. And in the quiet hour before dawn, that thin place in the night where shift workers begin to move like ghosts changing guard, Noah walked, calmly and without theatrics, into deep storage. He unlocked the gate, stepped inside, closed it gently behind him, not to trap anything in, not to keep anything out. Simply because he had always closed it, and habits are rivers that do not stop flowing just because the landscape has changed. He stood before the copper-wrapped chest. The chant did not fill the room this time. It filled him. His lungs breathed in rhythm. His heartbeat marked the tempo. His tongue lay ready, like a tool placed neatly beside a craftsman's hand. He did not kneel. He did not bow. He simply opened his mouth, and the language stepped into the air like a figure crossing a threshold. Aharu kana, tau, adim. The words fell into the room with the weight of memory, not loud, not theatrical, simply inevitable. He felt his jaw move with a grace that was not entirely his. The muscles did not strain. The throat did not tighten. Speech flowed the way water flows from a tilted jug, steady, obedient to gravity, unconcerned with where it lands. The copper warmed, not physically though, later. Officers would swear the box felt hotter to the touch when they moved it into secure quarantine, but metaphorically. Warm like a hand taken after a long separation. Warm like recognition. He did not open the lid. He did not need to, because the ritual, whatever it had once been meant to do, wasn't about the object. It was about the mouth, and Noah's mouth now belonged partly to the mirror. Not stolen, not possessed, shared. He moved through the phrases with the unthinking fluency of someone reciting their childhood address, words learned so deeply they ceased to be words and become a place. There were sections of the chant that rose and fell like tides, others that rattled like pebbles in a priest's hand. One long, aching vowel that felt like the sound you make when grief finally finds a crack to pour itself through. When he reached that one, his eyes burned, not with fear, with understanding. This language had been created by people who understood that grief needed shape, and that if you didn't give it shape, it would carve one for itself in the softest part of your mind. He gave it shape. His voice, not quite his, trembled. Esan. A soft, answering sigh came from the copper. Not a spirit, not a presence, simply the completion of a circuit. The language had sought a mouth. It had one now. It had no reason to remain silent anymore. And ears acted. When Noah finished, the room felt different. Not brighter, not darker. Balanced, as though all the unspoken things the mirror had been waiting to say for a century and a half had now been placed gently, respectfully, back into the world entrusted to someone who would carry them without breaking. He closed his lips. The silence afterward was not empty. It was sacred. He rested his forehead lightly against the cool steel of the cubby door. Eyes closed, breath steady. His heart did not race. His mind did not scream. He simply stood there, held, and when he finally spoke his own language again, hours later, it came out accented ever so slightly by something older. A resonance, a harmony, like a church bell that keeps ringing inside your bones long after you've left the sanctuary. Moriens, from that day forward, people noticed a change in him. He was calmer, kinder, more patient. But when he spoke, even to say something as ordinary as morning, listeners sometimes felt a strange aftertaste of emotion, as though his words had been dipped briefly in honey and salt before being offered to the air. And every night, the radios and computers and printers sang softly with the language. Not frantic, not malicious, simply practicing, like a choir waiting for the rest of the congregation to finally remember the tune. Nesta, but the mirror was not done. It had always been meant to be used, and the city, despite itself, was beginning to hear, which meant, inevitably, someone would answer. Warily 5. The last change was the smallest. It happened in the space between breaths, that fragile seam where the body forgets, for a fraction of a moment, which direction air is meant to travel. Noah was shelving a collection of seized documents when it arrived, a task he'd performed 1,000 quiet nights before. The papers smelled of damp ink and human anxiety. He liked the way they slotted into the archive boxes, neat, contained, absolved of their context. He turned his head to listen to the building breathe, and the building listened back, not with ears, with language. The chant did not rise. It did not fall. It simply aligned. His pulse, the HVAC hum, the faint tap of loose metal in a vent, the whisper of paper being slid into a folder, all of it folded into a single rhythm, smooth as tide, patient as stone. His lips parted to ask a question he didn't have words for, but another question came out instead. In the language, not tentative, not exploratory, affluent. It flowed like water through a channel that had been carved 1,000 years ago, the course already set, the journey already mapped. His mouth shaped sounds that held grief, obedience, devotion, and something quieter and more dangerous than all three, belonging. He did not intend to kneel, but he found himself, slowly, unconsciously, lowering into a crouched forehead, briefly touching the cool concrete, hands resting loosely on the floor like a monk at prayer. He wasn't worshiping. He was aligning, becoming the instrument he had been trained gently, relentlessly to become. When he rose, the world had not altered. He had, planning, Percendate for Imling K. The investigation began the next morning. It had to. Reports had been filed by the constable, the clerk, the night security supervisor who'd heard the radios rehearsing liturgy after hours. Someone up the chain had read the word chanting enough times that concern finally outweighed bemusement. They came quietly, as people do when they don't yet know what they're afraid of. a detective inspector, 2 officers from professional standards, a digital forensics specialist carrying a laptop like a shield. They found Noah at his desk. Calm, polite, hands folded. He greeted them with that faint, warm resonance that had begun to tint his voice, the second timbre that wasn't quite an echo. Morning. They asked questions. He answered them precisely, gently, like a man reciting facts he'd spent years memorizing. His tone never wavered. His hand stayed open on the table, and sometimes, woven so faintly through his English that it could be dismissed as the shifting of breath, the language made small appearances, a syllable tucked behind a word, a vowel shared between sentences, a ghost of ritual cadence guiding the pauses. The specialist checked the radio logs. Dead channels, no transmissions. He ran diagnostics on the printer, the computers, the security system. Nothing. Noah watched him with the same mild interest he brought to most human processes, now affection, without attachment. He offered tea. He apologized for the dust. He smiled. When the inspector asked very carefully whether Noah had felt compelled to speak, Noah tilted his head. The old Noah, the one built of small jokes and mild loneliness, might have searched for a neutral word. The new Noah simply told the truth. I'm being shared, he said gently. It isn't ownership. It's occupancy. As calm. Silence followed, the kind of silence normally reserved for hospital corridors, where words can bruise if they're handled clumsily. Shared by what, Mr. Calder? The inspector asked. Noah smiled again, and the mirror smiled through him. His mouth opened almost conversationally, and the language stepped into the room without needing any mediation. Norukana thal arimesan. The detective felt something unnameable pass through him. Not fear, not awe. Something older and simpler. Recognition of rhythm. The body understands chant long before the mind gives it meaning. Stop, the inspector said softly, almost pleading. Noah stopped, immediately. He was not hostile. He was obedient, just not to them. They asked where the sound had come from. He told them. He led them to the copper-bound box, like a curator leading visitors to a long-hidden exhibit. His touch on the chains was tender, protective, almost. He didn't open the lid. He didn't need to. His presence completed the ritual geometry the mirror had been patiently sketching across the room for months. The officers listened, the radio unconnected. Long dead sighed. Not loudly, just enough. The inspector made his decision. Secure the item, he said quietly. And so they did, sealing it in a reinforced case, logging it into a different system, placing it under layered protections designed to keep dangerous things from ever being reached again. They did not realize this relic did not require hands. It required a mouth, and it had one. Dies in. No under and on. Dies in. Dies in. The final scene did not belong to a thriller. It belonged to a sleepwalker's dream. They found Noah the following morning when he failed to badge out at the end of shift. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't fleeing. He was sitting cross-legged in one of the storage aisles chained from a retired set of restraints looped loosely around his torso and arms. Not tightened, simply present, like the memory of a ritual someone had tried to reconstruct from incomplete notes. He was whispering, not fast, not frantic, patient, precisi. The language moved through him with the calm inevitability of old water flowing through a familiar channel. His eyes were open, soft, gentle. The officers called his name. He turned toward them slowly, as though his body had become a bell responding to a distant strike. And when he spoke, it was unclear even to him where Noah ended and the mirror began, because there was no contest. There was consent. The chant did not stop when they placed a blanket around his shoulders. It did not stop in the ambulance. It did not stop in the small, neutral hospital room filled with equipment that pretended it understood the human body. Sometimes, it was loud enough to be heard. Sometimes, it slipped beneath hearing like a current under the surface of a river, but it never fully left his mouth. Not anymore, because the language had found a home. Not in the box, not in the evidence locker, not in the machines that occasionally hummed along. In a man who had spent his life caring for things no one else wanted to remember. And there is no safer host than someone who believes care is a duty. They moved the relic, eventually. New protocols, New storage. Noah did not resist. He did not ask where it went. It didn't matter. He could still feel it. Distance meant nothing to a language that had survived the death of the people who spoke it. He spent his days in careful observation, writing in English what he could recall of the script when asked. Experts came, linguists, historians, a priest or two. They all heard the chant differently. Some said it sounded like lament. Others thought it sounded like prayer. One young woman, a doctoral student with notebooks full of careful phonetics, listened for a long time, her face softening by degrees, until finally she whispered, "It sounds like, remember me." Noah smiled. He liked that. He still went quiet when spoken to, still thanked people for tea, still apologized when his voice slipped and carried a second tone beneath it. He was not lost. He was inhabited. And late at night, when the corridors outside fell into that long, tender hush that belongs only to places where people try to heal, he would sit by the window and let the chant move through him like a tide across sand. Not demanding, not cruel, just unending. A mouth that never fully closes, a prayer that never quite finishes, a language that refuses extinction by the simplest, most human method. It teaches someone to love it. Ending reflection. Midnight radio soft. If you ever walk past a police facility after dark and hear a radio humming when no one is there to tune it, if a printer stirs and prints lines you cannot read, your own name curled at the center like a seed, if someone speaks to you with a voice that seems to carry a second echo, not haunting, not hostile, just patient, remember this. Not every relic wants to be displayed. Some relics want to continue, and languages, even dead ones, hate being alone. So if you hear chanting where there should be silence, don't join in. Because once a language knows the shape of your mouth, it never quite forgets the way home. The 3 a.m. incinerator. Marcus Hale had learned, over time, that death had a smell. Not the dramatic Hollywood version, no rot, no sweetness, no gothic flourish. The smell here was industrial, neutral. The lingering trace of disinfectant, recycled air, and heat-stressed metal. The crematorium was designed to be emotionless, a building that pretended it didn't understand what went on inside it. That was why Marcus liked it. You didn't need to think about grief when you were managing combustion rates and system diagnostics. You didn't need to think about the people whose lives had emptied into the capsules he loaded. You just needed to type the temperature threshold 1,600 degrees Fahrenheit and let the automation handle what flesh becomes. He worked nights. No traffic, no grieving families, just the sound of the ventilation system drawing long, slow breaths through the metal lungs of the building. The crematorium stood at the edge of the suburbs where the streetlights began to forget themselves. Cornfields took over beyond the chain-link fence, black and infinite at night. Sometimes coyotes called thin, uncertain cries that sounded embarrassed to exist so close to cul-de-sacs and drive-through coffee shops. Inside, the light was always the same. Flat, medical white. It turned skin sallow. It erased shadows. It made the stainless steel reflective enough that Marcus sometimes caught his own face at the wrong angle and didn't recognize it right away. Silent companions, he called the machines. Not out loud, just in his head. The furnace was the largest of them, a long rectangular unit with a hydraulic tray and a bank of status displays mounted above like watchful eyes. The thermal imaging monitor installed to ensure safety. Compliance displayed a palette of color-coded heat across the chamber whenever it was in operation. Blue meant idle cool. Orange meant warming. White meant end-stage burn. He knew those colors like a doctor knows heart rhythms. He trusted them, until the night they began to behave like something that could keep secrets. Worst nature, it started quietly. 3 to 15 a.m. Marcus was halfway through logging intake data for a case scheduled for the following afternoon standard procedure. Name, age, weight, religious preferences, authorization forms. That strange, gentle bureaucracy that tries to keep grief from spilling into the cracks. The system pinged. Thermal unit online cycle. Initializing. Marcus frowned. He hadn't queued a cycle. There were no remains on premises, ready for chamber entry. The intake fridge was empty. The schedule board was blank. For a moment he thought it was a glitch, a false positive. It happened. Sometimes. Sensors sulk. software hiccups, then the furnace sighed awake. The hydraulic loader whispered forward on its rail with the soft patience of something that has done the same job for many, many years. The chamber's ignition jets hissed. A blue flame blossomed. Wrong. Blue flame didn't belong here. Cremation flames weren't supposed to look cold. Marcus rolled his chair closer. The monitor flickered into thermal mode colors, washing across the chamber interior like ghost weather. Cool blues and greens. Warmer oranges blooming at the base where the jets licked the refractory brick. But something else was there too. Something the system interpreted as living temperature. A heat signature shape. Small, child-sized, sitting cross-legged at the center of the empty chamber. Marcus leaned forward until the edges of the screen almost pressed into the bridge of his nose. He increased contrast. He sharpened the gradients. The shape remained. A pale humanoid glow, narrow shoulders, bowed head. Small hands resting on small knees. And around those hands, the blue flames curled and played like affectionate pets. The figure didn't burn, didn't distort, didn't even register discomfort. It just existed. A child made out of temperature. Marcus's first thought was malfunction, faulty sensor, bad calibration. That was easier to believe than the alternative that something was sitting, calm and comfortable, inside a furnace hot enough to turn bone into dust. He typed a manual override command. System response. Locked. He tried again. Same reply. The chamber burned on, blue tongues of fire moving with a slow, curious grace. The child shape tilted its head. Marcus froze. It hadn't moved like a glitch. It had moved like something that had noticed him. He swallowed. "This is stupid," he muttered softly. "It's a pixel artifact. It's heat bloom. It's..." The child on the monitor lifted one hand, slowly, deliberately, and waved. Marcus's hand, his real one, hovered uselessly in midair above the keyboard. The child's hand remained raised for a second longer, as though waiting to see if he would return the gesture. Then the figure lowered it, folded its arms back into its lap, and began to play with the fire again. The blue flames stretched toward those small hands like eager ribbons. Marcus realized he had stopped breathing. He performed the only rational action left to a man who did not want to believe in anything. He wheeled his chair around, pushed to his feet, and opened the blast-resistant observation window to look directly not at a monitor, not at a representation, but into the real, physical chamber. Empty. Absolutely empty. Just the blue fire and the brick. No child. No shadow. No trick of the light. He looked back at the monitor. The child sat exactly where it had been, as calm as a doll. He looked at the chamber. Empty. Monitor. Child. Chamber. Empty. Marcus closed the viewing panel slowly, letting the heavy latch fall into place with a metallic clack that sounded far too loud in the sterile room. His heart wasn't hammering. It was waiting. Because the figure, whatever it was, didn't feel malicious. It didn't feel threatening. It felt lonely. Like a child waiting on a swing long after the other children have gone home. And then it did something that stole the last of the oxygen from the room. It shuffled forward until the heat signature face was tilted fully toward the camera. For a few seconds, the figure was very still. Then its mouth opened wide, not screaming, laughing. The thermal display rendered the heat of that open mouth as a bright, almost white glow. And though there was no sound, no speakers, no source for it to exist beyond the pixels, Marcus heard it anyway, not with his ears, with some deeper place. A child's laughter echoing off brick, soft, happy, desperate to share. His throat worked. "It isn't real," he whispered to the empty air. "It isn't real." The child in the furnace stopped laughing. Slowly, its small hand lifted again. This time it didn't wave. It beckoned. A simple, universal gesture. "Come play." The blue flames curled lazily around its legs. The system clock above the monitor read 03:15 a.m. Exactly, to the second. The furnace remained online for 7 minutes and 19 seconds. Then without command, without cue, the flames died. The loader withdrew. The display went dark. The system log generated a single line of text. Unscheduled maintenance cycle complete. Marcus stared at the empty chamber for a long time. Then he shut down the terminal and told no one. Because there is something about witnessing the impossible that makes you protective of it, even when you should be afraid. especially when it looks like a child. And no for those. Got a now for dode. For 2 nights afterward, the furnace slept. Marcus told himself he was grateful. He threw himself into routine like a drowning man gripping a buoy, logging forms, calibrating scales, wiping stainless steel until he could see his own tired face staring back at him in sterile reflection. He pretended that nothing had happened, that the blue fire had not bloomed by itself, that a child had not waved from inside a machine built for ash and bone, that he had not felt beneath the shock a faint, aching tenderness. But 3 a.m. has a gravity all its own. It gathers the day's discards, the forgotten thoughts, the unfinished fears, and lets them drift back into the room like dust motes in weak light. By 3:10, Marcus had begun to watch the clock without meaning to. By 3:14, he'd stopped breathing evenly. By 3:15, thermal unit online cycle initializing. No shimmy, no fanfare. Just that quiet digital line appearing on the monitor like a sentence that had been waiting all day for permission to exist. Marcus didn't move for a second. Then the familiar hydraulic sigh filled the room, the sound of metal sliding forward into predetermined grooves. The ignition jets hissed again. Blue fire licked the brick like a curious tongue. And there, as though it had never been gone at all, sat the child. Same small shoulders, same cross-legged posture, same way the flames leaned toward it, like affectionate animals. Only now, the child was closer to the camera. It had shifted, scooted forward, as though it had learned the location of the lens and wanted to be seen a little better. Marcus rolled forward in his chair, not urgently, helplessly, his eyes fixed on the pale heat shape. His palms felt damp against the plastic of the armrests. He didn't blink as often as a normal man should. The child tilted its head, noticing him again, and this time, it waved immediately, like a friend spotting you across a playground. Marcus whispered before he could stop himself. Hi. Wait. The sound didn't go anywhere. It wasn't meant to. It was a reflex. Something you say without thinking when a small hand waves at you. The child froze, just for a fraction of a second. Then it lifted both hands and clapped them together. Bright white flashes bloomed across the thermal display where the palms struck little flares of delighted heat. Marcus swallowed. You can hear me? His voice sounded wrong inside the room, too human, too fragile, too alive for a place where lives had already ended. The child didn't answer. Of course it didn't. There was no microphone, no audio feed, no mechanism at all. It was heat rendered as color, temperature pretending to be a body. And yet, the child pointed to itself, a small, clear gesture, then pointed at the furnace floor beneath it, then at the flames. Then, back to itself, as though explaining where it lived. Marcus pressed a hand to his mouth. He had worked this job for 5 years. He had seen grief in all its disguises, anger, numbness, brittle politeness, held together with staples and hope. He had never, not once, seen a child, real or otherwise, inside a chamber like this. He didn't know what to do with the feeling that rose up inside him. It wasn't fear. It was protectiveness. Ridiculous, impossible, heartbreaking protectiveness for a thing that could not burn. The child cocked its head again, that same curious angle from the first night, and tapped its own chest. Marcus understood. You want a name? The child didn't respond in any logical way. Instead, it copied him. It lifted one hand to its chest and held it there, small fingers splayed, as if waiting for something to arrive beneath them. Marcus realized, with a slow unfurling dread and awe hybrid, that this thing had been alone for a very, very long time. What are you? He whispered. Who are you? The child just watched him. The blue flames curled around its calves. Somewhere in the machinery, a cooling fan kicked on, filling the silence with a low, constant exhale. Marcus's shift badge hung around his neck, name printed in block corporate lettering. Marcus Hale, operations technician. The child's head turned slowly. Heat eyes, if that's what they were, fixed on the badge. It leaned forward. The heat signature of its face brightened. Marcus touched the badge reflexively. Marcus, he said, barely audible. That's my name. The child lifted its hand again, pointed at him, then touched its own small chest, pointed at him again, then touched its chest again, like a game of catch. Marcus shook his head. No, I'm Marcus. He stopped. What do you call a child made of heat? What do you name a ghost that sits inside a machine? The child's hand remained pressed against its chest. Patient, hopeful. Marcus closed his eyes. Memory is strange, unreliable. It fumbles through boxes you didn't know you still kept. He remembered a name he had not spoken aloud in many years. A name that had lived, briefly, inside a crib by a window facing the yard. A name printed once on a tiny hospital bracelet that he had never been able to stop keeping in the back of a drawer. Daniel, his son. 3 days, blue hospital light, tubes, 2 quiet nurses, the smell of antiseptic and milk and fear. Marcus opened his eyes. The flames jerked just a little. The child tilted its head. He hadn't meant to say it out loud, but he had. Daniel, he breathed. The thermal figure shuddered, not violently, delicately, like a held note finding harmony. Its small hand pressed harder to its chest, bright heat blooming beneath the palm. Then it pointed to itself, a short, decisive gesture, as though saying, yes. Marcus's throat locked. No, he whispered, eyes burning. No, that's not. You're not. The child looked at him with that blank, innocent, devastating patience, and smiled, or at least its heat signature mouth brightened in a way the image processor interpreted as joy. The furnace hummed. The monitors glowed. Blue fire breathed. Marcus pressed both hands flat to the desk as though the room might tilt and drop him otherwise. You're not my son, he said quietly. The child tilted its head the other way. Then it did something that broke him cleanly in half. It held out both hands toward the glass. Open, inviting, like a child reaching to be lifted. Marcus flinched back in his chair. The room suddenly felt too bright, too sterile, too cruel. He stood up and crossed to the observation window, his legs uncertain, his heart beating a slow, hollow drum behind his ribs. He pressed his palm lightly to the thick glass. The chamber, to the naked eye, was empty. Just bricks, just blue flame, just heat and light and nothing at all. But on the monitor, the child pressed its small hand to the same invisible place. Palm to palm, pixels to skin. The heat signature flared white where their hands should have met. Marcus closed his eyes. I'm sorry, he whispered. He didn't know what he was apologizing for. Leaving, surviving, being alive in a room made for endings. All of it. The child in the blue fire did not seem to understand apology. It only understood contact. It leaned in, and for a fraction of a second, just long enough for Marcus to doubt himself in the future, he felt warmth pulse against his skin through layers of industrial material and common sense. Not burning heat, not pain, just the soft, living temperature of a small hand. He sucked in a sharp breath and stepped back. The connection broke. The child watched him calmly. Then it did something new. It tapped its own chest again, then mimed, writing in the air. Slowly, carefully, like a child learning letters. Marcus stared. You want me to say it again? The child waited. Marcus swallowed. Daniel. The child tapped its chest again, held its palm there, like claiming a gift. Marcus felt something inside his chest tear quietly, not a violent rip, just the slow giveaway of old grief when it finally admits someone has said its name out loud. The clock above the monitor ticked in clinical indifference. 03:22 a.m. The furnace cycled down. The flames vanished with a final soft hiss. The loader withdrew. The thermal display faded to blue nothing. The child went with it, leaving Marcus staring at an empty chamber and a reflection of himself he barely recognized. He sank back into his chair and let the silence fill the room like water in a glass. He knew with the calm certainty of a tide turning that the furnace would wake up again tomorrow, and the night after, and the night after that, because whatever Daniel was, he had been alone for a very long time, and now he had learned a name, not his, but close enough to feel like belonging. YF. Grief has a gravity, not the loud kind that drags you to your knees in a church aisle, but the quiet kind, the kind that tilts your everyday life by a few invisible degrees until you find yourself walking the same hallway at the same time each night, because something there is waiting. By the end of the week, Marcus stopped pretending he wasn't waiting too. He didn't rush through tasks. He didn't slack. He simply learned to pace his shift so that his hands were free at 3:14 a.m., as though he were a priest preparing the altar rather than a technician logging inventory into a system that did not care whether the dead had ever laughed. He didn't think of it as an appointment, but it was. No, the third time the furnace woke itself, the system didn't even pretend to malfunction. There was no error code, no glitch, no justification, just thermal unit, online cycle initializing. Then the familiar sigh of hydraulics, the hush of ignition jets, and the bloom of blue. Marcus rolled his chair forward before he even realized he had moved. The child Daniel was already there, waiting. He sat closer to the glass than before, knees drawn up, head tilted in that same puzzled way. He waved the instant Marcus came into frame as if he had been practicing the gesture, afraid of getting it wrong. Marcus raised a hand in return. The child brightened. Not visually, the thermal resolution didn't include joy as color, but somehow the shape sharpened, as though attention had a heat signature of its own. "Hey," Marcus murmured. He didn't mean for his voice to soften like that. It just did. Daniel's hand lifted toward the glass, palm open, hopeful, but this time the boy didn't keep it there. Instead, he shifted further forward and tapped the floor of the furnace with small, bright fingertips. Then he tapped the air between himself and the glass. Then the floor again. Then the air. Marcus frowned. "You want me to come closer?" The boy lifted both hands, clapped once. Heat flared in cheerful white. Marcus stood before he could talk himself out of it and approached the observation window. The chamber, to the naked eye, was empty as always, just brick and blue fire, but the monitor showed the child stretching his little arms outward as if to close the distance. Marcus laid his palm against the glass again. The boy mirrored him instantly. A faint pressure of memory warmth pulsed against his skin. Not physically, not truly, but powerfully enough that his mind filled in the sensation the way it fills in phantom pains from old scars. "Daniel," Marcus whispered, his breath fogging faintly. The child pressed both palms to the glass now. Closer, closer, and then, carefully like a child trying out a new skill, he turned his head toward the opposite end of the chamber. He gestured. A little flick of the wrist. Come on." Marcus stepped back. "No," he said gently, like you might to a toddler reaching toward a hot stove. "No, buddy. I can't go in there." The boy didn't understand the words, but he understood the refusal. He tilted his head again, puzzled. Then he smiled as if to reassure Marcus that really honestly there was nothing to worry about. He scooped the blue fire into his hands like water and let it spill through his fingers. "See? Safe. It doesn't hurt." He held the flame out to the lens. A shy, hopeful offering. Marcus's stomach tightened. "Daniel, I can't," he said again, more to himself than to the thing inside the machine. The child's hands lowered. The heat signature dimmed. Not anger, not rejection, just disappointment. The kind of disappointment that doesn't know how to stay small. "Isn't fast. I'll fold." The furnace began to choose after that. Not bodies, there were none on premises during Marcus's shift. Not cycles, didn't need an excuse anymore. It chose moments. A sigh from the ventilation system. A flicker in the hallway light. A long, slow breath. Marcus didn't realize he'd been holding. 3:15 was still the anchor. The ritual. But some nights the blue flame lingered longer. Sometimes 20 minutes. Sometimes nearly an hour. The logs recorded everything in bland, indifferent font. Unscheduled thermal event. Safe range, no service required. But Marcus understood. This wasn't error. This was presence. And presence gets curious. Why? To Dager Odin. Canning one night. Around the 10th visitation, Daniel did something new. He stood up. Not abruptly. Not theatrically. He simply unfolded. A small body made of warm color gradients, rising from cross-legged stillness into a standing shape inside the chamber. His head almost brushed the top curve of the furnace arch. Marcus leaned closer to the monitor without meaning to. The boy walked slowly, curiously across the chamber floor. Heat pooled where his feet touched. Small white footprints bloomed and faded. He reached the far wall and pressed both hands to the brick, as if testing the limits of his world. Then he turned around and began to walk toward the door. Marcus's heart hit the back of his throat. The loading hatch was sealed. Triple checked. secure, but the child approached it like a front door at the end of a hallway he had always meant to explore. He pressed his small, bright hands to the inside of the metal. Marcus glanced instinctively at the outer control panel. The door was not opening. Of course it wasn't. Of course it couldn't. Still, he felt it, that quiet, dreadful tilt. Daniel had discovered the edge, and edges invite crossing. "Hey," Marcus whispered, stepping closer to the glass. "Hey, little man. Stay back, okay? Not safe." Daniel turned as if he had heard a true voice for the first time, and then he nodded. A small, solemn dip of the head. Obedient, trusting. Marcus laughed. A soft, broken sound full of relief and grief tangled together, and pressed his palm to the glass again. The boy came back. The warmth followed. But something had changed in that exchange. Not danger. Not yet. Just a realization. If you can move to the wall, then maybe one day you can move past it. Okay. The first hint that the furnace was beginning to prefer Marcus came from the daytime tech, a broad, tired man named Dawson, who always smelled faintly of coffee and eucalyptus cough drops. "You been doing tests overnight?" Dawson asked casually one morning, flipping through logs. "No," Marcus said, heart tapping harder than the conversation deserved. "Why?" "Chamber keeps spinning up around 3-ish, Dawson muttered. "No cues, no flags, no alarms. Just warm, like it's expecting company." He shrugged. "Probably a software patch. IT never emails. Anyway, you're lucky. Machine likes you. Never fights back on your shift." Marcus smiled thinly. "Machine likes you." He carried that sentence around all day like a stone in his pocket, because the thought that made everything worse was this. Maybe it wasn't the machine. Maybe it was the child. And maybe liking wasn't the right word at all. Maybe the child had chosen. Now we zing. That night, the furnace woke earlier than usual. "Send in Sheriffin." Marcus was still rinsing his mug when he heard the loader move. His body knew the sound now, could have recognized it in a hurricane. He set the mug down carefully, walked back to the console. Daniel was already there, but he wasn't sitting. He was standing, hands pressed to the glass, face tilted up, mouth a bright crescent of joy. He didn't wave. He reached. Marcus stopped a few feet from the observation window, and somehow, without the boy having made a sound, he heard the meaning anyway. "Come play." The child mimed it. He tapped the glass, pointed to the blue fire, tapped the glass, pointed to his own chest. Then he pressed his palms together beneath his chin in a pleading gesture so universally human that Marcus's knees actually felt weak. "I can't," he whispered, voice cracking. "I can't. If I go in there, I won't come back out." The child blinked, then did something that made the cold fluorescent room feel suddenly smaller. He backed away from the flame. 2 steps, 3, until the fire barely touched him. Then he pointed firmly back at the open space he'd just left, like a child saying, "See? I'll move. It's your turn." Marcus stared. His breath came shallow and shaky. Something inside him, that old, unhealed place where lullabies had died before they'd been needed, leaned forward. Because this child wasn't threatening him. He was making room. He was trying to share. And loneliness, especially when it wears a small face, can be the most terrifying kindness in the world. Where spotty, the first safety alarm saved him. A compressor somewhere in the building coughed and restarted a harsh, metallic sound that shattered the fragile moment. Marcus flinched. Daniel flinched too. He stared toward the source of the noise, though he couldn't possibly hear it, then looked back at Marcus with a hesitation that had not been there before. Fear? No, not fear. Confusion. Why would anyone be afraid of a place where nothing hurts you? The clock ticked. Send in Arshabafen. The flames dimmed. The chamber cycled down. Daniel's shape, thinned edges softening, glow fading. He held his hands out in one last hopeful attempt, just once, like a child reaching as he is carried from a room. Then he was gone, leaving Marcus alone with the empty chamber, the clinical light, and the unbearable weight of the fact that something inside that oven had started to think of him as company. And loneliness, once it learns a face, rarely lets go quietly. Word. Oh, there are boundaries in every workplace. Fire doors, security doors, doors that only open when certain rules have been satisfied. Marcus trusted those doors. They were the difference between night shift and funeral. between process and danger. That trust was the first thing to fail. This clue. Ari. The next visitation didn't wait for 3:15. It arrived at 3:03, as if impatience had finally reached a small pair of invisible hands. Marcus was at the far end of the corridor, checking backup oxygen canisters, when he heard it. The smooth, heavy slide of the hydraulic loader moving forward, that familiar sigh that had begun to sound less like machinery and more like a breath. His heart went hollow. He didn't hurry. He walked, calmly, because if he hurried, if he ran, that would mean he had accepted something was wrong. And Marcus had learned that sometimes the only thread holding the night together was pretending the thread wasn't fraying. He reached the control room. The flames were already blue, and Daniel was waiting, not sitting, standing, close, too close. His small heat shape hovered only inches from the lens, face tilted upward, features smoothed into a glow that read somehow as joyful recognition. The child lifted both hands and pressed them to the glass. Marcus pressed his palm gently to the same spot, the ritual they had both learned, the gesture that made the sterile room feel, for one brief moment, like a nursery. "Hi," Marcus whispered. The boy didn't wave this time. He turned, slowly, deliberately, and looked at the inner hatch, the one connected to the loader, the one that should only ever open when there was someone to load. Marcus's pulse thickened. "No," he said softly. "No, buddy, that's not." The hatch clicked, a quiet little sound, harmless on its own, like a teacup being placed on a saucer. But in this room, in this place, it was the sound of a rule loosening. The hydraulic loader eased forward another inch. Marcus stepped toward the console. His hand hovered over the emergency stop. He didn't press it. He told himself he was waiting, assessing, being responsible. But in truth, he simply didn't want to hurt the boy. That was the lie grief tells you. If you draw a boundary, you're being cruel. Work. Do it is. The boy tapped the floor again, his soothing pantomime of invitation. Then he did something new. He stepped out of the fire. The flames stayed where they were, licking the back wall with their curious blue tongues, but Daniel walked forward until the heat of him glowed bright across the chamber floor. He was still only a shape, a body made of temperature and computation, but he carried himself like a child, practicing bravery. He pointed to the hatch, then to himself, then to Marcus. A circle of sharing. "Daniel," Marcus whispered, tears tightening his throat, not from fear, not even from grief, but from the unbearable sweetness of being wanted by something that didn't know how to want gently. "You can't do that. You can't. It's not safe." "My ass." The boy cocked his head in that familiar puzzled tilt. He lifted one bare, heat-bright foot and placed it directly into the blue flame. He stood there, unharmed. Then he stepped back out again. He smiled, or the thermal equivalent of smiling. "See?" Marcus pressed his forehead briefly to the cool glass. "How do you explain to someone who doesn't burn what burning means?" "You fried." Variously, the first malfunction alert arrived at 3:11. Chamber door latch. Partial disengage. Marcus stared at the message. His hand finally slammed the stop command. Nothing happened. He typed the override sequence. System response locked. The loader hummed contentedly to itself, a toy train on tracks it had worn into the floor. Daniel watched Marcus with a sudden, aching seriousness. He pressed one hand very slowly to the inside of the hatch. On the thermals, it glowed white. On the outside panel, another little click. A fraction more movement. The distance between sealed and open narrowed by a breath. Bang. When? Game. Marcus spoke, then not to the machine, not to the night, but to that bright, impossible child in the heart of the furnace. "You can't come out," he whispered, "and I can't come in. Those are the rules. Do you understand? Those are the rules." Daniel listened. His hand remained on metal. The flames licked behind him, calm, obedient, blue. The clock above the console ticked. "Send in Sharafin. Send in Tresenfin." The boy lowered his hand. Relief flooded Marcus's chest so suddenly it almost hurt. Then the boy did something that turned relief into dread, so pure it almost felt like love. He sat down, right there in front of the hatch, cross-legged, waiting, as though to say, "It's all right. We don't have to rush. I'll wait with you until you're ready." And the loader, responding to a command no human had given, eased the hatch forward another millimeter. One yes. "Charleston, there are kinds of kindness that can kill you." Marcus understood that now. Not anger, not vengeance, just a small, lonely hand held out to you in a place where fire wears blue clothes, asking you, in the only language it knows, to stay. By Ras friends pallor, by Ras friends bin natter, by Ras friends bin natter. He tried the manual emergency cutoffs. He killed the main breaker. He cycled the auxiliary controls. Each time, the furnace hesitated, and then resumed. Like a child pretending not to hear the word bedtime, the hatch crept forward. Another little click. The fire breathed. Daniel did not move. He only watched Marcus with that impossible trust. The kind of trust that breaks grown men. Marcus pressed his whole palm to the glass. "Please," he whispered, voice shaking now. "Please don't ask me to do this." The child lifted one hand and pressed it to the glass, too. Palm to palm, the heat flared white on the monitor so bright it blurred the edges, washing Daniel's outline into a small, luminous star in the center of the chamber. The world narrowed. The room. The glass. The warmth. The tiny ghost of a child who thought the fire was a game, and loneliness was a room you didn't have to leave if someone promised to sit there with you. "There's more." Heffernan, the hatch reached its final arrest point. Not open, not closed, just waiting. The machine logged it calmly. "Ready. State manual confirmation required." Marcus laughed a thin, helpless sound, because of course it did. Of course all of this, the waking cycles, the slow edge-walking, had been leading toward this one gentle, devastating request. So yes, consent. Even the machine wanted that much. Even the haunting understood permission. Daniel lifted both hands toward the hatch, not pushing, not prying, just ready, as if to say, "I won't pull. You have to come the last inch yourself." More. The compressor coughed again. The room flickered, and in that flicker for a heartbeat only Marcus saw something he had never seen before. The reflection of the fire, not on the glass, not on the monitor, in the small metal plate of his name badge. Marcus Hale. The letters shone with blue light, and beneath them just for a moment another name surfaced in the reflection. Daniel. He sucked in a breath. The badge went dull. The reflection broke. The clock ticked too. Sending Schufen, and the furnace stopped. Like a child falling instantly asleep mid-play. The blue fire collapsed back into nothing. The hatch withdrew. The loader slid home with its usual polite finality. The room exhaled. Silence returned. The monitor went blank. Daniel, if he had ever been there at all, was gone, leaving Marcus standing alone in the clinical light with one palm still pressed to the glass and a wordless ache where his heart used to be. He slid down the wall until he was sitting on the cold tile floor. He stayed there for a long time, listening, just in case a small hand might tap back from the other side. None did. Not that night. Not the next. But Marcus knew the way. You know the tide will return to shore. That the furnace had learned something new. Not how to open. Not how to hurt. Something far more dangerous. How to wait. And children, even the ones made of blue fire, are very good at waiting. When they believe you are worth waiting for. 470s. The furnace slept for 3 nights. Marcus did not. He showed up, as always early, polite, steady, the kind of worker management forgets to worry about because he never makes a fuss. He checked the intake logs. He calibrated the scales. He wiped the brush steel until his own tired face blurred across it like a ghost that didn't want to commit. And at 3:15, when nothing happened, he told himself it was over. He told himself the child had been a glitch, a hallucination, a hurt he'd carried too long wearing the mask of a miracle. But every night, at the exact moment the hour turned, he found himself turning toward the glass anyway, waiting, listening, offering a silence that felt suspiciously like prayer. The 4th night, he stopped pretending. He turned off the radio, dimmed the overheads, sat in the control chair and folded his hands in his lap like a man attending evening service in a church built from vents and ductwork. The clock changed. Send in Schufen, and the furnace woke up, not with urgency, With relief, the loader sighed. The ignition coaxed blue life from the burners. Heat bloomed across the thermal screen like the first pale spill of dawn. And there he was, Daniel, sitting, cross-legged, small hands resting lightly on his knees. He didn't wave this time. He just looked like someone who has waited a very long time for a door that finally opens the right amount. Marcus rolled forward. The room seemed to move with him. "Hey," he murmured. His voice didn't sound like it belonged to him anymore. "You came back." Daniel pressed his hand to the glass. Marcus raised his palm automatically, breath-catching when that phantom warmth bloomed in memory against his skin. They stayed like that a while. No games, no gestures, just presence, like a lullaby that had forgotten its words but kept the tune anyway. Then the boy lowered his hand. He stood. He took one quiet, deliberate step forward, toward the hatch. Marcus shook his head before he even knew he was doing it. "No, not that. Please." But Daniel wasn't pushing. He wasn't prying. He was waiting. He turned his face toward Marcus, that soft, rounded shape made of thermal gradients and impossible affection, and he did something he had never done before. He mimed breathing, a slow inhale, a slow exhale, as if to say, "It's easy. You just do what I do." Marcus's eyes blurred. "Buddy, I can't follow you," he whispered. "That's not a door for people like me." "As worry." The child tilted his head again, puzzled, wounded, patient, then took one careful step back toward the blue fire, as if demonstrating that he wasn't asking Marcus to be brave alone. He would meet him halfway. He always had. The loader made that quiet, awful click. "Ready. State manual confirmation required. Consent. Always consent." Even the machine wanted him to choose. Marcus laid both hands on the console. He didn't move toward the hatch. He didn't move away. He remembered rocking a crib in a too-bright hospital room that smelled like milk and antiseptic. He remembered a name on a bracelet. He remembered the way silence had arrived, not as a scream, but as a pause that never ended. He remembered being the only one left in the room. And now, years later, here he was again. 3:15 inches the morning in a white-lit building made for endings with something small and lonely. Looking at him like the last light left in the world, the boy held out both hands, not grabbing, not pleading, just offering. A gift, a mistake, a kindness sharpened into danger by the simple fact of being returned. Marcus rested his forehead gently against the glass. "I'm so sorry," he breathed. He didn't say what for. He didn't need to. Daniel lowered his hands. He sat back down, and in that small, heartbreaking act, that surrender, that acceptance of a boundary he could not see or understand, it became clear what the child had wanted all along. Not obedience, not sacrifice, just company. Someone to sit on the other side of the glass at 3:15 so the night didn't feel quite so endless. The furnace hummed, the flames danced, and Marcus did the only thing he could safely give. He stayed. He stayed until the clock said 3:29, and the cycle wound itself gently down, and the blue light faded, and the boy dissolved into the ordinary heat of brick. He stayed after that, too. A long time. Hands folded, eyes closed, like a man keeping vigil for something that had never had a funeral. Now, before remained, they found him like that at shift change, sitting in the soft light, calm, quiet, exhausted but gentle in a way that made the day crew feel instinctively like they should lower their voices. He didn't tell them anything. He didn't need to. He wrote a resignation notice that sounded like every other simple, decent resignation notice in the world, thanking management for the opportunity, citing personal reasons, offering to help with the handoff of responsibilities. He worked his notice period. He trained the replacement. He never once mentioned 3:15. But on his last night, before he turned in his badge and keycard, he did one final thing. He walked back to the control room at 3:14, turned off the radio, dimmed the lights, and sat down. When the furnace woke right on cue, the blue fire bloomed like a quiet greeting. Daniel appeared. He waved. Marcus waved back. No words, no gestures toward the hatch. Just two figures sitting in their separate worlds, one made of heat, one made of breath, sharing the same small patch of time, the way people sometimes share a bench in a park without ever asking each other's names. When the child lifted his hand to the glass, Marcus pressed his palm there too. The warmth bloomed again. Not really. Not physically, but real enough for the heart. "Good night," Marcus whispered. The child tilted his head. Then very slowly he mimed, breathing again. In, out, calm, safe. Marcus nodded. He closed his eyes. The furnace cycled down at 3:30. The loader withdrew. The blue light went out. And somewhere in the circuitry, or the fire, or the impossible place where grief and technology meet, a child who didn't understand death learned something close enough to mercy. If you really love someone, you let them stay on their side of the glass. Knees in, Nings him. Marcus left before dawn. He didn't look back, but sometimes years later, at odd hours when the house felt too quiet, he would wake at 3:15 for no reason at all and lie there very still, listening. And in that thin windowed silence, where the world forgets what time is supposed to mean, he would almost hear it. A soft hydraulic sigh, a quiet blue bloom, and the echo of a child's gentle laughter waiting for the sound of footsteps that would never come again. And somehow, that felt kinder than leaving him alone forever without a goodbye. Some haunted places don't want to hurt you. Some haunted places are just rooms that learned a person once stood there and never quite got over it. And sometimes the most dangerous invitation in the world doesn't come from anger or hunger or cruelty, but from a small voice asking, so innocently, "Won't you sit with me a while?" If you ever hear that question, especially at 3:15 inches in the morning, be gentle, be kind, but don't cross the line, because even blue fire doesn't know how to give you back once it learns your name. The village of silent echoes. Fog makes mountains look honest. That's what Riley always said at the beginning of his travel vlogs, not because it made sense, but because it felt like it did. Fog wraps around the trees, sinks into the folds of the hills, and pulls the world in closer. It hides the edges. It turns distance into suggestion. It also, Riley had discovered, made good thumbnails. He followed the old mining road deeper into the Appalachian foothills, camera mounted to the chest rig, microphone shielded with a fuzzy gray wind muff that always reminded him of some small sleeping animal. Each step crunched on gravel, softened by moss and decades of neglect. "This is it," he murmured for the recording, his voice low so the mountains wouldn't hear it as a challenge. Population unknown. Founded sometime in the 1,860 seconds. Cut off when the coal company pulled out. No modern records, no cell towers, and supposedly, he smiled into the lens. Everyone left in one night. The forest swallowed the road and then, almost reluctantly, released it again into a clearing. The village sat there like a memory that hadn't quite faded. Maybe 20 houses, white clapboard, sagging porches, windows that reflected only fog and the outline of a sky uncertain of itself. Riley stopped recording for a second, not because he meant to, because the quiet pressed gently against the camera button and asked him to. No birds, no insects. Even the wind had gone thoughtful. "Okay?" he whispered, more to himself than to the viewers he hoped would someday pay his rent. "Okay, that's new." He started rolling again. "Guys, there is no sound here," he narrated. "Like nothing. I don't even know how to describe it. It's like the air got vacuum sealed." He stepped off the road. His boots sank into the soft earth beside a picket fence, leaning as though it had grown tired of posture. Weeds brushed his calves. The fog shifted with the hesitant grace of a shy animal never quite clearing, never quite committing to concealment. The first house had curtains, clean ones. That was wrong. He knew this, the way his body knew when a rope was about to give way or a floorboard wasn't holding anything underneath it. Abandoned houses don't keep clean curtains. They sag. They yellow. They surrender. These fluttered, freshly washed in the open window. Riley swallowed. "Okay," he whispered into the mic. "Maybe there's a caretaker. Or someone came back." He stepped onto the porch. The wood didn't creak. It tightened. Only for a moment, a small, almost imperceptible shiver underfoot like the house had inhaled when he arrived. The door wasn't locked. Abandoned houses usually are, as though people think a key can keep entropy from getting in. This one opened on the first touch. The smell hit him first. Not mold, not dust. Chicken stew. Warm, savory, steam, soft. He stepped inside. The table in the front room was set for 4. Thick ceramic bowls, metal spoons, a loaf of bread with a knife laid neatly beside it. One bowl still steamed. Riley stared at it, heart knocking softly at the inside of his chest. Somebody was just here. He breathed into the camera. Like, just here. The chairs told another story. They weren't tucked in. They were slightly pulled back, barely noticeable, like people had stood up quickly, but politely, and never returned. He turned slowly in place. The house was tidy, not scrubbed, not staged, just lived in. A sweater hung from a peg by the door, arms dangling as though the ghost of the wearer was still inside, unsure whether to leave. A child's drawing was taped to the wall, a stick family standing in front of a triangle house, all smiling lines and hopeful colors. In the corner, a rocking chair had worn a faint crescent into the floor. He checked the bedrooms. Beds made, boots by a chair, a Bible left open beside a lamp as if its reader had gone to refill their tea and never returned. He put the camera down for a moment, just listened. The quiet felt thick, not empty, full, like a room that had just been laughing and fallen silent when you walked in. Something brushed the window outside. Not wind, slow, careful, deliberate. Riley stepped to the porch, pulse fluttering like a moth. The fog had rearranged itself while he was inside, pooling lower, threading around fence posts, curling at the angles of every building. He scanned the tree line. Nothing moved, but the feeling did. Eyes, not one pair, not two, many, not close enough to see, close enough to be certain. "Hello?" he called, instantly regretting the loudness of his own voice. It felt like throwing a rock into a mirror-still lake. No one answered. Instead, the fog shifted only slightly as though weight had shifted inside it. He went to the second house. Same story. Curtains neat. Table set. Steam. A single mug of coffee left half full. A rainbow slick of oil still glistening at the top like a memory of heat. The bathroom vanity had a glass of water with a toothbrush still inside. The mirror. He stopped. His reflection looked back at him, face pale, camera harness black against his jacket. But behind him, for a fraction of a heartbeat, something else occupied the doorway. Tall, bent, slightly wrong, colorless as the fog. Then gone. He spun. Nothing. Just the wallpaper, the hall, the open front door. He forced a laugh into the mic. "Okay," he said, voice too bright. "Either there's a very dedicated historical reenactor society up here, or something is very weird." He kept walking, through the village, house to house, every table set, every meal warm, every chair not tucked in. Sometimes there were shoes placed neatly by doors, sometimes sweaters waiting on hooks, sometimes open books with spines quietly aching under the weight of their own story. But never, ever, people. By the 7th house, the fear settled in. It didn't arrive like thunder. It arrived like static, a crawling at the edges of thought, a knowledge that the silence wasn't absence. It was hiding. Riley stood in the middle of the street, if you could call it that, and slowly rotated with the camera. "Okay, guys," he said, forcing calm into the narration. "Here's what we know. Everyone left in the middle of a meal. No signs of struggle, no wildlife activity. Everything is preserved, like a habit, like the day repeats and repeats, but the people aren't here to live it. So either this is staged, or he didn't finish." Because that was when he realized something else. There were no footprints, not on the road, not on the porches, not through the dew-damp grass, not even his own. He looked down. The earth held the memory of shape, faint pressure, almost optical but no real indentation, as though the ground refused to acknowledge that anything with weight had ever stepped there. The sensation of being watched sharpened. He turned toward the forest again, and that was when he saw it. Not movement, not a figure, a discrepancy. One of the trees at the edge of the clearing had fingers. They were not obvious, not until you understood what you were seeing, and then you couldn't unsee them. The roots at the base of the trunk were too articulated. The bark over the lower half rippled like pale skin trying to remember the right texture. The grain around the knotholes curved like the echo of a face, trying not to be one. The tree was holding still, deliberately. Riley blinked hard. "No," he whispered. "No, no, no." He scanned the tree line again, really looked this time, and the world rearranged. That boulder over there? Not a boulder. A shoulder. That split fence post? An arm bent backward at a wrong angle. That hump of moss? A back, curved and trembling. They were everywhere. Not moving, not breathing, not quite human, but close enough that his eyes, once taught how to see them, began dragging fear across his nerves like a bow across strings. Dozens of them. Maybe more. Hidden in plain sight by a camouflage that wasn't paint or ghillie suits, but body. "Jesus," he whispered. You're right there." None of them reacted. None turned. None blinked. They were pretending to be landscape, and they were good at it. Good the way only desperation ever is. He took one cautious step backward. The closest tree, a woman twisted into shape, her ribs grown stiff like branches tightened imperceptibly. The bark over her chest shivered like a second skin trying not to crack. That was when he understood. They weren't hiding from him. They were hiding with him, still outside the hiding place, which meant something else was watching all of them. Riley slowly raised the camera. His mouth went dry. He didn't say another word, because he was suddenly, painfully certain of two things. The villagers had never left. They were terrified of being seen breathing, and he was the only thing in the open that still did. Me firmly. Riley didn't move at first. He didn't dare. The camera was still recording, little red light blinking like a fragile heartbeat against his chest, and he suddenly hated it for being so loud, so alive, because now he understood the shape of the silence. It wasn't emptiness. It was discipline. No wind. No footsteps. No voices. And absolutely, totally, horrifyingly, no breathing. He realized this when he finally let out a trembling exhale through his nose, and the tree woman nearest to him shuddered. Just once, like a violin string plucked by a rough hand. Her bark skin tightened. Her chest tried desperately not to expand, and Riley, who had spent years crawling through abandoned asylums and collapsed mills, felt fear settle into his bones like wet sand. "You're hiding," he whispered before he could stop himself. And the moment the word left his mouth, the world around him seemed to lean in. Not the villagers, not the houses, the fog. It shifted with intention. Not breeze, like something tall had just turned its head in a room you thought you were alone in. Riley clamped his mouth shut. Too late. Somewhere, beyond the road, inside the white blur of fog and trees, came a sound he didn't know how to name. It wasn't a growl. It wasn't a footstep. It was like air changing direction. And every villager-shaped tree-stone fence post reacted the same way. They became perfect. Every ripple of muscle flattened. Every hint of breath vanished. Even the heat seemed to dim around them. They were not hiding from sight. They were hiding from inhalation. Riley's lungs rebelled, burning, begging, and when he finally dragged in a breath, the fog seemed to follow it for an inch. As if it had weight, something was tracking the pressure of lungs filling. Something was listening for the intimacy of oxygen traded for carbon dioxide. Something that hunted not movement, not heat, but breathing. He tried to steady himself, tried to match the stillness of the village, but panic made his chest stutter, a ragged rhythm that felt loud enough to shatter windows, and in the far tree line, something vast and unseen shifted its weight again. Closer this time, curious, patient, as though it had just realized there was one thing here that still dared to be alive. Riley realized very quickly that he was the only thing here still allowed to breathe. The villagers hadn't vanished. They had simply traded humanity for stillness, becoming walls and trees and fences because anything with lungs was hunted. And the fog knew. It didn't rush. It noticed. Something tall and subtractive moved at the edge of the clearing. Not a body, but an absence where the world forgot to exist, and the air around it tightened like cloth around a fist. Riley pressed his lips together until pain bloomed there, his lungs aching, begging. Because the body does not care about rules when oxygen runs out. He risked a glance at the nearest stone wall, and saw, beneath the careful camouflage of dust and lichen, the faintest ripple of effort, a person trying not to inhale. not to be. Every disguised villager was the same. Perfect stillness, chest barely shifting, as though they had practiced the art of not living for years. Riley lasted 5 more seconds, then instinct tore a gasp out of him. The fog pivoted. No sound, no face, just a tension cutting through the clearing like a blade. It leaned toward him, curious, gentle, and horribly certain. Before it could close the distance, something else moved a house at the far edge of town. Just an inch, a tremor of wood and ribs and hidden lungs. The fog turned. Predators don't hurry when the world belongs to them. It drifted to the house, and Riley understood with sick relief that the village had sacrificed a mistake to save him. He could see now, inside the shape of walls and beams, the outline of a human being who had surrendered their form for camouflage and failed, just once, to hold still. The air around the house became a decision. The village braced. Riley shut his eyes because he didn't want to learn the sound of being found. And then the house simply stopped existing. Not broken, not destroyed, erased. A word removed from a sentence without leaving a gap. The fog accepted the absence with a lover's patience. Silence settled again, thick, obedient, terrified. Riley finally let out a shaking breath and knew, with a clarity that cut him to the bone, that this place wasn't cursed. It was hiding. Every person here had learned the single law that kept them alive. Don't be heard breathing. And now that he knew the rule, he also knew the truth pressing against his ribs like a second heart. Sooner or later, he would have to break it. Riley learned the second rule the hard way. Once the fog notices you, it does not forget the shape of your breathing. He tried to leave the clearing at dusk, when the sky turned the color of old bruises and the silence grew heavy with expectation. But the path he'd come in on no longer existed. The forest had reshaped itself into a corridor of listening, trees leaning just close enough that every inhale echoed back at him like a confession. His chest ached from holding still, from trying to sip air instead of drink it, but even the smallest breath felt loud. That was when one of the villagers finally moved toward him, a crooked fence that unbent itself, revealing a man's face beneath layers of bark and mud, lips sealed with resin, eyes bright with a terror so disciplined it had become a habit. He didn't speak. He couldn't. Instead, he pressed a shaking finger to the place where his mouth should have opened and then pointed toward the center of the village where the fog was thickest, as if warning Riley that the thing inside it was closer now, searching the air the way sharks taste the ocean. Riley nodded, though he didn't know what he was agreeing to, and the man guided him between houses and bodies disguised as furniture. Each villager risking the smallest shift a shoulder here, to a foot there, to clear a silent path for the intruder who didn't yet know how to disappear. The fog followed them at a distance, never rushing, like a god that already owns all the endings and is simply curious which one you'll walk into. At the heart of the village stood a well, stone, old, rim-worn, smoothed by hands that had once believed in water, and the man pointed down into it, then at Riley's chest, then back into the dark, as if the well had learned to swallow sound and might hide his breathing there. Riley leaned over, dizzy, desperate, hearing his own breath bouncing back at him in damp echoes. And for a moment he understood. This wasn't just a hiding place. It was an ecosystem of fear. The villagers had built their lives around the choreography of lungs, every movement measured against the patience of the thing in the fog. And now that he had arrived, his breathing was a stain on their silence. The fog thickened behind him. The air tasted metallic, like a coin held too long on the tongue. Riley closed his eyes, pressed his face toward the cool dark of the well, and tried to draw his next breath small enough that the world wouldn't notice. But the world did, and the fog leaned closer, pleased, as though it had just learned a new name. Riley understood too late that the village hadn't been asking him to escape. They had been begging him not to be the reason they were found. The man with the resin-sealed lips guided him down into the well, using a rope that frayed like an old thought, every twist of the fibers whispering across Riley's palms as he slipped below the lip of stone and into the cool throat of the earth. Down there the world sounded different, not silent but layered, like his breathing had become 2 sounds instead of 1, the breath he took, and the echo the well tried to swallow. Above him, the villagers arranged themselves again into the shapes of walls and trees, locking into the stillness of a prayer they had been saying for years, while the fog drifted into the center of the village with the slow certainty of a tide. Riley pressed his mouth to the crook of his arm, trying to dampen the sound of air being borrowed from the world. But panic has teeth, and it gnawed his discipline down to splinters until a small, broken inhale escaped him, tiny, fragile, but honest. The fog paused. It didn't rush toward the well. It simply became interested. Riley felt it the way you feel weather changing. A pressure behind the eyes, a weight at the base of the skull, a realization that the air you depend on also belongs to something else. He held still, trembling, lungs beating like wings inside a cage, and slowly the villagers above him began to cheat, a shoulder tightening, a rib flexing, not enough to betray themselves, just enough to lend him courage, which was worse, because courage is loud. The fog moved closer, curious, patient, tasting the contours of their held breath the way a hand finds the outlines of a face in the dark. Riley knew then that he had brought danger with him, the way ships bring rats to new shores, not on purpose, just by existing. He did the only kindness he could think of. He exhaled, long and clear, letting the well drink the sound of it so the village wouldn't have to. And he climbed. Every rung up the rope scraped his palms and tore at the ghost of hope. But he didn't stop until he reached the lip and faced the open world again. The villagers did not move. They were landscapes now. They had to be. Riley stepped backward, out of the clearing, into the trees, lungs burning, not running, because running is a language predators are fluent in, but walking like someone who has finally remembered they have somewhere else to be. The fog followed only to the edge of the village, as though bound by an agreement written in breath long before he arrived. And there it waited, listening to the silence settle back into its proper shape. Riley didn't know how long he walked. He only knew that when he finally dared to breathe deeply again. Tears filled his eyes from the simple violence of relief. He never uploaded the footage. He never went back. But for the rest of his life, whenever he found himself awake at night and the room felt too still, he would hold his breath without thinking. Just for a moment, out of respect for a village that had learned the cost of being heard by something that loves the sound of lungs. And somewhere, far away in the fog-heavy Appalachians, tables stayed set, meals stayed warm, and an entire town kept pretending to be scenery because the only way to outlive the thing that hunts your breathing is to become the kind of world it cannot tell is alive. The night shift at Street Jude's, the last thing they ever removed from Street Jude's psychiatric hospital, was the loudspeaker system, those cracked beige boxes bolted into the peeling walls, wires rattling inside like old bones, and Evan, the night guard, hated them because they were everywhere and supposedly dead, disconnected, harmless, but still watching him from every corridor of the abandoned building as demolition inched forward by day and silence took over at night. He walked his rounds with a flashlight and a thermos, pretending the east wing didn't make the air taste faintly metallic, like a coin pressed against the tongue. And on his 15th shift, at 2:47 a.m., the loudspeakers clicked on and static sighed through the halls like the hospital was trying to breathe again. Then a calm, educated male voice announced, "Medical note, patient observation log, Ward C. Patient in room 404 requires immediate surgical intervention." The words gliding through the building as gently as a scalpel through skin. Evan froze, because there was no room 404. Never had been, not on the blueprints, not on the wall maps where the numbers stopped neatly at 403, but the message repeated, precise and emotionless, while his radio refused to answer him back, just crackling like something breathing too close. He walked anyway, past 399, 400, 401, 402, 403, until the hallway met a blank wall marked for demolition, and there, from the plaster itself, a single red line began to bleed, thickening as it crept downward and pattered onto the tile in slow, measured drops. The speaker whispered again. This time, he cannot feel pain. Proceed. And the wall groaned like something being kneaded from the inside, a hidden seam appearing in the exact place a door should be if 404 existed. Scratching began behind it, patient, rhythmic, nails tracing where stitches once were, and as Evan stared, a final whisper breathed through the loudspeaker, far too calm for the words it spoke. Scalpel. The wall pulsed. The air tasted like history cut open. And Evan finally understood that Street Jude's was not simply being torn down, it was being taken apart. Evan told himself he wouldn't go back to the East Wing, that he would log the incident as faulty wiring and wait until morning, but the building had learned his name. Now every loudspeaker seemed to breathe it when he walked beneath, and at 2:47 a.m., the next night the static returned like a tide, followed by the same calm doctor's voice noting, "Patient in room 404 requires immediate surgical intervention," except this time, after a small hiss, another voice came through, softer, strained, like someone speaking from under a blanket of water. "I'm still here." Evan stood very still in the intake office, the radio heavy in his hand, while the speakers crackled and the doctor continued dictating clinical phrases in that placid tone: vitals, sedation levels, observations, and every so often the second voice slipped beneath it, barely audible, whispering fragments of sentences that never finished, as though the walls were trying to confess something and losing courage halfway. He walked the corridor again, past the numbered doors that made sense and toward the blank wall that didn't, and as he approached, the red seam that wasn't supposed to bleed trembled like a closed eyelid trying not to twitch. The speaker above him sighed, and the doctor announced, "We proceed in 5, then paused, then corrected himself. "We proceed in 3, and Evan realized with a slow, crawling dread that the recording wasn't looping anymore. It was updating, as if the hospital were still practicing medicine on a ghost schedule no one had the right to keep. The second voice spoke again, closer now, clearer. "Tell them I never left," it said. And his radio, which had been silent for nights, crackled with a reply that wasn't dispatch at all, but the same distant breathing he'd heard through the wires, like the building had borrowed the frequency to exhale. Evan backed up until his shoulders touched the cool tile, the smell of old antiseptic and deeper things wrapping around him, and the doctor's voice softened further, almost fond, almost weary, as it concluded, "Room 404 remains unaccounted for treatment to continue until compliant." And the wall shuddered at that word, compliant, as though some part of it remembered what it felt like to refuse. Evan closed his eyes, not out of fear, but a strange, aching pity, because for the first time he understood that room 404 had never been a place on a map. It was a sentence the hospital had written around someone, until the building learned to speak it back. By the third night, Evan had stopped pretending Street Jude's was an empty building and started treating it like a patient who refused to be discharged, because at 2:47 a.m., the speakers came alive with static that sounded almost relieved, and the doctor's voice resumed its calm dictation. "Observation. Room 404 remains under surgical review," but now there was sound underneath the words. The faint, rhythmic thump, drag, thump, drag of footsteps that didn't belong to shoes on tile so much as bones, remembering where floors used to be, and they were coming from inside the wall that bled. Evan didn't shine his flashlight at it at first, because some instincts are older than fear, but the sound drew nearer with each repetition of the recording, as though the voice were calling something through the plaster, summoning it back to rounds, and when he finally lifted the beam, the red seam in the wall pulsed with each step like a heartbeat trying to find its owner. The doctor continued speaking in a voice that had never learned how to panic. "Scalpel requested. Compliance uncertain." And the second voice, the small one that sounded like it lived between teeth, whispered, "Don't let them open me again." So close now that Evan felt the words brush the inside of his ear from the wrong direction. His radio crackled with a weak imitation of dispatch, someone saying his call sign in a voice that almost sounded familiar, like the building had chewed the syllables and spat them back out. And when he brought it to his mouth, the breathing ear, it wasn't his. Behind the wall, the footsteps stopped. The plaster dented outward just a little, like a thumb pressed gently into soft bread, and a slow, scraping sound began. Metal over stone, deliberate and patient, as if something on the other side had been given a tool and a command and infinite time to obey. Evan whispered no without meaning to, but the wall listened, and the doctor's voice replied not to the patient, not to a nurse, but to him, saying, "Security to room 404. Attendance required." And every speaker in the hospital repeated it in widening circles until the words felt less like sound and more like policy carved into the air. The footsteps began again, retreating deeper into the wall as though expecting him to follow through it, and the bleeding seam narrowed, trying to decide whether to become a door or a scar, while Evan stood there in the humming half-light of a place that believed it was still working, realizing that he was no longer guarding a ruin. He was on shift. Evan had always thought of security work as simple: keep the doors locked, keep the wrong people out, but street Jude's had different ideas about who belonged inside. And on the fourth night, when the clock slid toward 2:47 a.m., the loudspeakers woke with a sound like paper being unfolded, and the doctor calmly announced, "Security to room 404, surgical review in progress," as if this had always been part of Evan's job description. The wall at the end of the corridor was no longer pretending to be a wall, its red seam widening into the suggestion of a frame, plaster thinning the way skin thins over bone, and he realized with a slow, reluctant dread that the hospital wasn't revealing a door, it was building one around a memory. He stepped closer because the voice had asked, and because nothing in his training covered what to do when the past starts giving orders. And as he approached, the doctor's tone softened into something almost conversational. "Patient remains uncooperative," followed by the smaller voice from inside, trembling. "Please, I'll be good this time." And the words tangled together in the air until it was hard to tell which belonged to the living and which to the recorded. The bleeding had slowed to a steady seep, dark and precise, tracing the outline of hinges where none existed, and Evan felt the floor tilt with the weight of an old truth, that this place had carved rooms for problems rather than solving them, while his radio flickered to life with a single instruction that made his stomach drop. "Unlock." He looked down at his key ring, ridiculous in its ordinariness, and when he looked up again, there was, impossibly, a lock where bare plaster had been moments before, dull metal set into flesh-colored wall as if the building had grown it for him. His hand moved before his sense could catch it, the key sliding into the new lock with a familiarity that felt rehearsed, and somewhere behind the speakers a nurse's voice, kind, tired, said, "Don't make it worse, dear," which sounded less like comfort than resignation. Evan didn't turn the key. He held it there, suspended in a decision that had started years before he was born, and the wall pulsed against the metal like a vein beneath skin. From the other side came a soft tapping, not frantic now, not begging, just steady, like someone keeping time with their fear. The doctor's voice grew quiet. "Proceed when ready," he said, and the hospital waited with him, a whole building holding its breath, believing that compliance was a virtue and doors were just boundaries that hadn't been convinced yet. Evan stood there with the key resting inside the lock that shouldn't exist, the metal warming slowly under his fingers like the building was trying to make it feel familiar. And for a long moment, no one, not the hospital, not the voice in the wall, not even the past, seemed to breathe. Then the loudspeaker gave a soft sigh, and the doctor's calm, impossible voice said, "We are ready to begin." And the smaller voice on the other side whispered, "Please don't leave me here again," so gently that it sounded less like fear than exhaustion. Evan realized then that room 404 wasn't a place they'd forgotten to build. It was a place they'd built too well, a diagnosis given shape, a punishment disguised as treatment, a room someone had been left in so long that the hospital itself had learned to miss them. He didn't turn the key. Instead, he pulled it out with a quiet click that felt like a decision, and the wall flinched, not angry, just startled, like a hand reaching for another hand and finding air. The doctor's voice paused for the first time since this began, then resumed softer, almost regretful. "Patient remains unavailable. Continue observations." And the red seam in the wall slowly sealed itself again, the bleeding thinning to a memory, the hinges smoothing back into plaster until it was just a blank end of hallway with nothing to say for itself. The footsteps behind the wall retreated in slow, reluctant echoes, and the smaller voice faded to a whisper that might have been "thank you," or might have been the sound of tape peeling away from old records. Evan finished his shift. He filed no report. On his last night at Street, Jude's, when the demolition crews finally cut power to the East Wing for good, the speakers gave one last static breath and fell silent. And in that silence he felt something ease, not released, not healed, but acknowledged, like a patient who has finally been listened to after years of being charted. He took another job after that, somewhere with clean walls and lights that didn't remember more than they had to. But every now and then at 2:47 a.m., he'd wake up to the memory of a soft voice saying, "Room 404," and he would lie very still, grateful that there was no building around him to obey. And out where street, Jude's once stood, beneath the rubble and weeds, there is a section of earth that always feels slightly warmer, as if a room that never officially existed is still keeping a quiet night shift not to hurt anyone. Not anymore, but because sometimes the past simply doesn't know where else to go. The wrong gate. Oliver never remembered the impact, only the silence afterward. One moment he was stepping off the last train of the night, half asleep with music whispering in his ears. And the next, there was a slip, a blur, a collapse of sound, then nothing. When he opened his eyes, the station looked the same but emptier, the fluorescent lights humming like they were tired of existing, and the platform stretched out like a dream trying to remember itself. People were standing along the edge, but not where the real train doors would be. Instead, they waited at blank stretches of wall, positioned with eerie precision, all facing the dark tunnel. Their faces were smudged, as if a thumb had dragged across their features. Oliver stood slowly, feeling strangely weightless, and asked whether the last train was still running, but no one looked at him. They only leaned forward toward the tunnel like flowers turning toward the sun. That was when he noticed the yellow safety line glowing softly, a boundary drawn across reality, and a familiar voice said, "Stay behind it." His mother was sitting on a bench like she'd just been waiting for him to get in from work. She looked exactly as she had before she died 7 years ago, hair pinned back, cardigan sleeves pushed up, and when he reached her, she took his wrist with a warm, real hand and said gently, "Don't cross the yellow line. Promise me." Down the platform, one of the waiting figures edged too close and the lights dimmed, as though something enormous had stirred in the tunnel. Oliver finally asked her where they were. "Between," she said, sadness tucked into the word. The dizziness came then, the station twisting away, and when he opened his eyes again, he was in a hospital bed with machines humming and a nurse whispering, "We almost lost you." Weeks later, back in the city, he saw them again. A small group of smudged-faced people standing at a bus stop where no bus stopped, all waiting at invisible doors. And among them, just briefly, his mother watched him pass and whispered, "Stay behind the line." Though there wasn't one painted there, not yet. After the accident, Oliver began to realize that the city wasn't different at all. It was simply that now he could see the parts of it that ordinary eyes politely ignored. In places where no one should ever be waiting, the corner of a deserted shopping mall corridor, the service exit of a subway station, the shadowed edge beneath an office building awning, there were always a few people standing in a quiet line, positioned carefully in front of doors that did not exist. They never spoke, never shifted, never acknowledged the living world around them. They waited the way polite commuters wait for a train, except the train they were waiting for only existed in that half-world Oliver had briefly visited. What frightened him most wasn't them, it was how naturally his eyes now adjusted to seeing them. Sometimes he recognized faces. The old newspaper seller from the corner, a cashier who had once smiled at him every morning, people whose obituaries he remembered reading, and now they stood here, calmly, as if they had reached the right place at exactly the right time. One rainy afternoon, while waiting for the bus, he saw his mother again. She didn't look at him, just placed a gentle hand on his arm the way she used to, a weight that was soft but unmistakably there, and whispered, "Don't step over the yellow line, sweetheart." Oliver looked down. There was no line painted on the pavement, but he understood it was still there, only not meant for the living to see. When the bus arrived, the ordinary passengers boarded, and the smudged-faced figures remained exactly where they were, waiting for a different door to open, one that didn't belong to this bus, or even this world. Oliver realized he had taken a step backward without thinking. Like every inch of distance he put between himself and that invisible threshold was a decision to remain. From the corner of his eye, he sensed something in the air flowing, not wind, not people, but a current, gently guiding those who belonged on the other side toward wherever they were meant to go. And he, by accident or miracle, had slipped loose from that current and washed back into life. That night, he lay awake and wondered how many people in the city were quietly lost between two worlds without ever knowing it. And in the middle of that, thought he heard his mother's voice again, soft as breath. "It isn't your time." It took Oliver a while to notice the pattern, but once he did, he couldn't unsee it. The wrong doors only opened when the world went quiet, late at night, during power outages. In the hush, after a city's collective intake of breath, when something terrible had just happened. He would be walking home past midnight, traffic lights blinking amber, shop windows dark and reflective, and suddenly, there they were, a small cluster of smudged-faced figures gathered in front of a blank wall or a maintenance gate or even just a stretch of empty air, all of them tilting their heads in the same direction like they were listening for footsteps from a place his ears couldn't follow. Sometimes a shimmer would ripple across the space they were facing, like heat above asphalt, and Oliver's stomach would drop, because he knew then that a gate had opened not visibly, not theatrically, just permitted itself to exist. When that happened, one of the waiting figures would simply step forward and vanish, not like someone disappearing behind a curtain, but like a word being erased mid-sentence, and the others would shuffle forward almost politely to fill the space they left behind. Once, during a citywide blackout, he saw 3 gates open at once, one at a train platform, one in the shadow of a hospital loading bay, and one beneath the neon sign of a late-night diner, and he felt the world tilt, like a house shifting on its foundations. That was the night he realized the gates weren't random. They opened when lives ended, when something in the delicate machinery of breathing stopped turning. And every time he saw that faint shimmer, every time he saw the waiting dead take a step through nothing, he half expected to see his mother among them, watching to make sure he stayed back. Once, he made the mistake of taking a step closer, just one, and the air on the other side of that invisible threshold felt colder, not cruel, not hungry, just final. His mother's voice came then, not from beside him this time, but from inside the memory of the station, saying, behind the yellow line, Oliver, with the same tired kindness she used when he was small and didn't yet understand danger. He retreated, heart pounding, and the shimmer faded like a dream at daylight. Walking home afterward through the 2 quiet streets, he understood something that chilled him more deeply than fear ever could. He wasn't meant to see the gates at all, and the only reason he still stood on the living side of the world was because, once, a hand he loved had refused to let him step across. It wasn't until Oliver finally gathered the courage to return to the bus stop from that night, the one where he'd first seen his mother standing among the waiting dead, that the shape of the truth began to settle around him like falling snow. It was late, the street lights humming softly, the city half asleep, and when he rounded the corner, they were already there, a quiet row of smudged-faced figures arranged in front of nothing at all, as orderly and patient as always. This time, though, he didn't hang back. He stood among them. The air felt thinner there, like breathing near the edge of a high cliff. He looked from one blurred face to another and slowly realized that they were all turned slightly toward him, not watching, but aware, the way strangers on a train sometimes acknowledge one another without ever making eye contact. And then he saw her. His mother didn't stand with the others. She stood a little apart, close enough to reach him, far enough that she could step between him and the invisible threshold if she had to. When she spoke, her voice was soft with pride and sorrow braided together. "You weren't supposed to be here that night," she said. "The gate opened for someone else. You just stood too close." Oliver felt the ground shift beneath the weight of the words. The accident, the silence, the station that wasn't a station. He had brushed the doorway by mistake. He turned, and only then did he notice the others fully: a cyclist in a torn reflective vest, a woman still clutching a broken phone, a boy with a backpack hanging from one shoulder, all of them marked by the unfinished shape of a moment that had ended too soon, all of them waiting with the kind of patience that doesn't belong to the living. "I kept you behind the line," his mother said gently, like a confession. "As long as you didn't step forward, they couldn't call your name." The air shimmered, then faint, like heat above a stove, and the waiting figures leaned toward it. That subtle collective movement Oliver had come to dread. One of them took a step and was simply gone. His mother's hand tightened around his wrist. "Not yet," she whispered, and though the gate was invisible, he felt it open and close in the air right beside him, like the slow blink of an unseen eye. Felt the brush of a world that was not cruel, just permanent. When the shimmer faded, the line of the waiting reorganized itself with quiet dignity, and Oliver realized what he had been given was not an escape, not a miracle, just a delay. But when he looked at his mother, who smiled at him like daylight through a kitchen window, he also understood that love could stand with him at the boundary for as long as he needed. guiding him softly back each time the wrong door opened. In months that followed, Oliver learned to live with the Gates the way you learn to live with a complicated neighbor, aware of their presence, respectful of their boundaries, pretending not to notice when pretending was kinder. He went back to work. He rode the subway again. He laughed with friends and sometimes forgot, for whole afternoons, that the world had seams invisible to most eyes. But late at night, on quiet streets or echoing platforms or beneath the unmoving glow of a bus shelter, he would still see them. The patient, smudged-faced figures waiting where no door should ever open, standing in front of patches of ordinary air that felt as thin as paper. And somewhere nearby, always, his mother would linger, not quite among them, not quite beside him, like a lamp left on in a room you hadn't realized was dark. She never said much anymore. She didn't have to. When the air shimmered and the waiting dead leaned forward, Oliver would feel the pull gentle, like a tide around his ankles, and every time, before he even realized he had moved, he would find himself taking one slow step back, behind the line that no one else could see. Sometimes he wondered what it would feel like to let the current take him, to step through nothing and finally understand what lay beyond the wrong doors. But then he would remember the warmth of his mother's hand on his wrist, the weight of all the unfinished mornings still waiting for him on the living side of the world, and the question would soften into something like gratitude. Years later, when the city had changed and he had changed with it, he would still wake now and then at night with the strange certainty that somewhere, at some quiet hour, the gate had opened for someone. A hospital room gone suddenly still, a car brought to a final hush, a breath that did not return, and he would lie there and think of the line glowing like a thin sunrise across a cracked platform floor. One day, he knew, he would stand at the right gate at the right time, and the hand on his wrist would loosen instead of holding tight. But until then, he walked past the places where the world grew thin with the careful reverence of someone who had already been mistaken once, whispering a thank you meant for a woman who waited just beyond the corner of his sight, not dragging him toward the other side, not urging him to stay, simply keeping watch at the yellow line until the day had finally belonged to him. If you're still with me, somewhere out there in the quiet, thank you for listening. The night has a way of making the world feel fragile, like we're walking a thin line we can't quite see. Wells with someone always waiting at the bottom. Mirrors that remember more than we do. Furnaces that learn the shape of our grief. Villages that survive by not breathing. Hospitals that never stop calling roll. And wrong gates opening in the middle of ordinary places, asking us gently if we're ready to step through. But here you are, still on this side, still breathing, still listening. Maybe that's the real comfort hidden inside the fear. That love can reach across the boundary when we wander too close. That sometimes the past only wants to be heard, and that the dark, for all its mystery, still lets us come back in the morning. So as you drift towards sleep, if you feel like someone is keeping watch just beyond the edge of the room, don't be afraid. It might simply be a memory making sure you don't step past your own yellow line just yet. Rest well tonight. Stay kind to the places your mind goes in the dark. And until we meet again, don't forget to look where the doors should never be. Good night.